Welcome. If you found this video, you probably know how this works by now. You've settled in, the lights are low, maybe you've pulled the blanket a little higher, and you're looking for something quiet and interesting to carry you towards sleep. Tonight we're going somewhere far, a place most people have never heard of, tucked into the rocky highlands of southern Africa, where the ruins of a civilization still stand after more than 600 years of silence. A kingdom that built walls without mortar, traded gold across oceans, and then, at some point, simply stopped. The people who built it walked away. Where they went, nobody fully agrees. What they left behind still confuses archaeologists to this day. This is the story of Great Zimbabwe, and it is one of the strangest, most quietly haunting mysteries in all of human history. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Let's begin at the very beginning, before the walls, before the towers, before the gold. Let's begin with the land itself. The place that would one day hold Great Zimbabwe sits in what is now the modern nation of Zimbabwe, named, in fact, after these ancient ruins. It rests on a high plateau, roughly 400 kilometers south of the Zambezi River, in a region of southern Africa that is neither flat desert nor dense jungle. It is something in between, and in many ways something more interesting than either. The landscape is defined by granite. Enormous granite formations called kopjes rise out of the ground in strange, rounded shapes, as if the earth itself is pressing upward from below and peeling back like an old wound. These boulders are not jagged and sharp the way mountains are. They are smooth and heavy and ancient, worn down by a billion years of rain and wind into something almost organic, almost alive. They hold heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Animals rest against them. People, once, built their homes in their shadow. The soil around the granite formations is rich. The altitude of the plateau, somewhere between 900 and 1500 meters above sea level, means the temperatures are gentler than you'd expect for a place so close to the equator. The rain falls in a proper season, soaking the red earth before the dry months return. Grass grows thick and gold in the dry season. Rivers thread through the valleys, and in the years we are talking about, 800 years ago and more, there were forests thick enough to disappear into, rivers clean enough to drink from, and grasslands wide enough to run cattle on for days without seeing another person. This was good land. This was land worth settling. The people who first came to live here were Bantu-speaking farming communities, part of a much larger migration of peoples that had been slowly spreading southward across the African continent for thousands of years. They were not wanderers or nomads in the way we sometimes imagine early peoples. They were farmers and herders, people who understood soil and rain and the slow rhythms of agriculture. They planted sorghum and millet. They kept cattle. They made pottery with distinctive shapes and decorative patterns pressed into the clay before it dried. And they had iron. This is important. By the time these farming communities were arriving on the Zimbabwe plateau, they already knew how to smelt iron ore and shape it into tools and weapons. That knowledge, brought with them from farther north, gave them a technological advantage over the landscape that earlier Stone Age peoples had not possessed. With iron tools, they could clear land more efficiently, harvest crops more reliably, build more permanent structures. The earliest traces of settled human life on the Zimbabwe plateau date to around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. We find their remnants in the archaeological record mostly as small farming villages, scattered across the hills, near reliable water sources, close to grazing land. For hundreds of years, these communities existed in a kind of quiet equilibrium, small enough to be fed by what the land gave them, mobile enough to shift when the soil tired or the rains failed. But then, somewhere around the 9th or 10th century, something began to change. And the change had nothing to do with farming or iron or the rainfall patterns of the plateau. The change came from gold. Gold had been present in the region for as long as people had been there. The rivers carried flakes of it in their gravel beds. The hillsides held veins of it in the rock. For the earliest farming communities, gold was not particularly useful. You could not make tools from it. You could not eat it. It was pretty, perhaps. But pretty does not fill a stomach. What changed was not the gold itself. What changed was that other people, far away across the Indian Ocean, had decided that gold was the most desirable substance in the world. The Indian Ocean Trade Network is one of the great underappreciated stories of human history. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Arab and Indian merchants had already figured out how to use the monsoon winds to sail reliably between the coasts of East Africa and the ports of the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent. The monsoon blows in one direction for half the year and the opposite direction for the other half, which means a merchant who knew his timing could sail east from Africa in the summer months and return west in the winter. This made regular, predictable trade across enormous distances possible. The East African coast, in those centuries, became a string of trading posts and small port towns, places where the goods of the interior could be exchanged for the manufactured luxuries of the wider world. Glass beads from Persia and India, glazed pottery from China and the Islamic world, cloth woven in Gujarat, silk, porcelain, spices. These goods made their way into the interior along trade routes that followed the river valleys south and westward from the coast. And what did the merchants want in return? Several things. Ivory, always. Animal skins. Enslaved people, tragically. But above all, as the centuries passed and the demand grew, gold. The Zimbabwe Plateau held some of the richest gold deposits in southern Africa, and the people living on that plateau, who had been farming and herding in quiet obscurity for centuries, suddenly found themselves in possession of something the whole world wanted. The shift was slow, the way most fundamental economic shifts are slow. It did not happen all at once, but gradually, over the course of the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries, communities on the plateau began organizing themselves around the extraction and trade of gold. Rivers were panned, rock was broken, gold was smelted and cast and sent eastward toward the coast in exchange for goods that had traveled thousands of miles from places no one on the plateau had ever seen. And as trade grew, the communities engaged in that trade grew richer and more powerful and more organized. The logic of trade requires hierarchy. Someone has to control the supply. Someone has to negotiate the exchange rates. Someone has to protect the caravans and guarantee the safety of the merchants passing through. In a world of scattered farming villages, the community that managed to establish control over the trade routes could accumulate wealth and power far beyond its neighbors. And wealth and power, in turn, attract more people. More skilled workers, more soldiers, more farmers to feed the growing population. This is the process that, over several centuries, produced what archaeologists have come to call the Mapungubwe culture and its successor, the Zimbabwe culture. And it is the process that ultimately produced Great Zimbabwe itself. But before we get to the stones, let me tell you about a place called Mapungubwe. Mapungubwe is a sandstone hill in what is now the very northeastern corner of South Africa, near the point where South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana all meet at the Limpopo River. It does not look remarkable from a distance. It is just a flat-topped hill rising above the surrounding woodland, the kind of feature you might drive past without noticing. But between roughly 900 and 1300 of the Common Era, Mapungubwe was the most important political and religious center in southern Africa. The people who made Mapungubwe their capital had mastered the gold trade. They controlled a network of exchange that stretched from the interior of the subcontinent all the way to the East African ports, and, through those ports, to the entire Indian Ocean world. They were receiving imported goods from China and Persia and India, and they were sending gold and ivory eastward in return. Archaeological excavations at Mapungubwe have uncovered fragments of Chinese porcelain and glass beads from as far away as India, buried alongside the remains of people who had never in their lives come within 2,000 kilometers of the ocean. And among the most striking objects found at Mapungubwe is a small golden rhinoceros. Made of thin sheets of beaten gold fitted over a wooden core, it is delicate and intricate, and clearly ceremonial, clearly expensive, clearly an object made for someone of enormous status. The golden rhinoceros of Mapungubwe is one of the most famous artifacts in all of African archaeology, and it sits today in a museum at the University of Pretoria. What Mapungubwe tells us is that before Great Zimbabwe became the dominant power on the plateau, there was already a sophisticated, hierarchical, wealthy civilization in the region, a civilization capable of fine craftsmanship, of long-distance trade, of accumulating material wealth, and organizing political authority in complex ways. Great Zimbabwe did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a long tradition, and when Mapungubwe declined, around the 13th century, the center of power shifted north, onto the plateau itself. The rains had perhaps become less reliable in the Limpopo Valley. The gold sources closer to Mapungubwe may have been depleted. Whatever the reasons, the dominant power moved, and it moved to a place already occupied by people who shared the same cultural traditions, the same gold trading networks, the same relationship with cattle and grain, and the rhythms of the African seasons. It moved, in time, to the place we call Great Zimbabwe. The word Zimbabwe almost certainly derives from the Shona language, the language spoken by the descendants of the people who built these ruins. The most commonly accepted interpretation is that Zimbabwe comes from Dzimba Dzamabwe, meaning houses of stone, or from Dzimba Woi, meaning venerated houses. Both interpretations point to the same idea. These were not ordinary buildings. These were important places, sacred places, places set apart from the ordinary world by their size and their solidity and the effort that went into their construction. The Shona people built in stone throughout the Zimbabwe plateau during the medieval period. Hundreds of stone enclosures have been found scattered across the region, most of them small, some of them medium-sized, a very few of them genuinely large. But the site we call Great Zimbabwe was by far the largest and most elaborate of all of them. It was the capital, the apex, the center of the whole system. The site itself covers an area of roughly 720 hectares, though the stone structures are concentrated in three main areas. The first is a rocky hill, sometimes called the Hill Complex or the Acropolis, though that last name was given to it by European colonizers and has fallen somewhat out of favor. The second is a valley of smaller stone enclosures spreading out below the hill, and the third, the most famous, the one that appears in almost every photograph of the site, is the Great Enclosure. Let me describe the Great Enclosure to you, because it is worth describing slowly. Imagine standing on flat ground, on a warm afternoon, on the eastern edge of the African interior. The air smells of dry grass, and somewhere in the distance, there is the sound of cattle. The sky is enormous, and the light is strong and horizontal, the way light gets late in the afternoon when it comes from the side rather than above. Before you is a wall. Not a wall like the walls of a building, not something you could look over or easily walk around. A wall so large that your first reaction is confusion, because your brain is trying to fit it into a category it does not belong to. It is nearly 250 meters in circumference. At its highest point, it rises 11 meters off the ground. At its thickest, the wall is more than 5 meters wide enough to walk on top of, wide enough to build a small room on top of, if you needed one. And it is made entirely of dry stone. No mortar, no cement, no bonding agent of any kind, just granite blocks, shaped by human hands from the granite outcroppings of the surrounding landscape, fitted together with a precision that makes the whole thing look like it was carved from a single piece of stone. In some sections, the courses of stone are level and even, each block cut to sit flush against its neighbors. In other sections, the courses undulate in a gentle wave pattern, which suggests the builders were not just solving an engineering problem but making an aesthetic choice, creating a surface that was not merely functional but also beautiful. Inside the Great Enclosure, there are other walls, partitioning the interior into smaller spaces. There are narrow passages, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side, that wind between the walls in ways that feel almost labyrinthine. And at one end of the interior, rising from the ground in a shape that has no obvious structural function, is a solid conical tower about 9 meters tall and roughly 5 meters in diameter at its base. It is made of the same dry stone as everything else. It is solid all the way through. There are no doors, no windows, no stairs, no hollow interior. It is simply there, standing as it has stood for 600 years in the silence of the enclosure. Nobody knows exactly what the conical tower was for. The best current thinking is that it may have been a symbolic or ritual object, rather than a functional one, perhaps representing a granary, symbolizing abundance and fertility and the king's power to feed his people. Perhaps it was a marker of authority, visible above the walls to anyone approaching the enclosure, announcing the power and ambition of the people who built it. Perhaps it meant something that we no longer have the cultural context to understand. These walls were built, scholars believe, between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, with the most intensive period of construction occurring in the 13th and 14th centuries. That is a long time. It means the Great Enclosure is not the product of a single king's ambition, not a monument raised in one reign by a workforce driven to extraordinary effort and then never touched again. It is instead the product of generations, each ruler adding to what came before, expanding the walls, refining the craftsmanship, pushing the structure a little further outward and upward. The wall's outer face, with its beautifully regular courses and decorative chevron patterns near the top, may represent the work of the last and most skilled generation of builders, a flourish added to a structure that had been growing for decades. The skill required to build these walls should not be underestimated. The builders had no pulleys, no cranes, no written engineering manuals. They had human hands, iron tools, and an accumulated tradition of working with stone that had been developing on the plateau for centuries. But the result is staggering. The outer wall of the Great Enclosure has been estimated to contain nearly 1 million granite blocks, each one cut, moved, and placed without mechanical assistance. The logistics of such a project, feeding and organizing and directing the workforce needed to do it, required exactly the kind of political authority and economic surplus that the gold trade had made possible. This is not coincidence. The walls of Great Zimbabwe are, in a very literal sense, made of gold. Not of the gold itself, but of the wealth that gold created, the ability to organize large numbers of people around a task that did not produce immediate food or shelter, but instead produced something more abstract. Prestige, authority, the visible demonstration of power. Who exactly lived within these walls? What was the shape of life inside the city of Great Zimbabwe at its height? At its peak, somewhere between the 13th and mid-15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe is estimated to have been home to somewhere between 10,000 and 18,000 people. That is a significant population for its time and place. In the context of medieval southern Africa, it was a metropolis. In the context of the medieval world more broadly, it was a substantial city, larger than many European towns of the same period. The stone enclosures were not where most of the population lived. The stone structures were reserved for the elite, for the ruling class, for the king and his family, and the religious figures who mediated between the human world and the spiritual one. The vast majority of the city's population lived in the spaces between and around the stone walls, in houses made of a material called daga. Daga is a mixture of clay and decomposed granite, sometimes mixed with cattle dung that dries to a hard, smooth surface, not unlike concrete. It can be shaped while wet and then hardens in the sun. Daga houses were comfortable and practical, well adapted to the climate of the plateau, and they were beautifully finished, their walls polished to a smooth, sometimes burnished surface. The problem, of course, is that daga does not survive the way stone does. Over centuries, the daga houses have melted back into the soil, leaving only the faintest traces in the archaeological record, a slight change in the composition of the ground, a remnant of a floor, a pit where food was stored. The people who lived in those houses are harder to find than the people who lived in the stone enclosures, but their numbers were far greater, and their labor was what made the whole city function. The economy of Great Zimbabwe was complex and layered. At its foundation was agriculture. The plateau around the city was farmed intensively, producing sorghum, millet, and other grain crops that fed the population. Cattle were central to the economy and the culture in ways that went far beyond simply being a food source. Cattle were wealth. Cattle were the medium through which social relationships were negotiated, bride wealth paid, alliances sealed. A man with many cattle was a powerful man. The king of Great Zimbabwe, at the height of the city's power, likely controlled herds of thousands of animals. But the gold trade was where the real surplus came from. The process worked something like this. Gold was mined in various locations across the plateau and surrounding regions, often by people working in small groups, panning rivers, or digging shallow alluvial workings. This gold made its way to Great Zimbabwe through a system of tribute, essentially a tax paid to the ruling power in exchange for protection, access to trade goods, and the authority of the king. The city then acted as the distribution point for the gold going east to the coast, and the luxury goods coming west from the coast. The port city of Sofala, on the coast of what is now Mozambique, was the main gateway through which Great Zimbabwe's trade flowed. Arab and later Swahili merchants maintained trading posts there, and caravans of porters moved between Sofala and the interior along routes that had been established over centuries. The goods arriving at Great Zimbabwe from these trade routes were remarkable in their origins. Archaeologists excavating the site have found fragments of Celadon pottery from China, Islamic glass beads, Persian faience, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. These objects, found hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast, in a society that had no ships and never sailed the ocean, are the physical evidence of how deeply connected Great Zimbabwe was to the wider world. The people of Great Zimbabwe were not isolated or primitive in the way that colonial narratives sometimes portrayed them. They were participants in a global trading system. They knew about the world beyond the plateau, even if they had never personally seen it. The Chinese Emperor's Court and the Great Zimbabwe King's Court may never have exchanged diplomatic missions, but the pottery from one court ended up buried in the soil of the other, which is its own kind of connection. Now, let me tell you about the king. Or rather, let me tell you what we know and do not know about the king, which are two different things and not always easy to separate. The ruler of Great Zimbabwe, at its height, was likely someone occupying a role that combined political authority with religious or sacred significance in a way that we in the modern world find difficult to fully understand. The king was not simply a political leader in the way we might think of one. He was also a mediator between the living world and the world of the ancestors. He was the person through whom the collective spiritual power of the community flowed. His health and vitality were understood to be connected to the health and vitality of the land itself. This kind of sacred kingship was common across many parts of sub-Saharan Africa in the medieval period, and it left particular traces in the way space was organized. The hill complex at Great Zimbabwe, the ancient fortified area at the top of the rocky hill that overlooks the valley, is believed to have been the residence and ceremonial center of the king. It was elevated, literally above the rest of the city, visible to all. Access was presumably controlled, not open to ordinary people, except on specific occasions. The view from the top of the hill is panoramic, taking in the Great Enclosure below and the valley spreading outward in all directions. Among the most evocative objects found in the excavations of Great Zimbabwe are a series of carved soapstone birds. 8 of them have been found, and the remains of a 9th. They sit atop carved soapstone columns, approximately a meter tall, and they depict birds that are a hybrid of naturalistic and stylized forms, with features suggesting both eagles and other species. They have lips, not beaks, which gives them a human quality, an ambiguity that feels deliberate. These were originally found mounted on the walls of the hill complex, looking out over the landscape. What exactly they represented, whether they were royal symbols, religious objects, representations of specific deities or ancestors, remains uncertain. But their presence and placement suggests they were objects of enormous significance. They are today among the most recognizable symbols of Zimbabwe as a nation, depicted on the country's flag and currency. The political structure of Great Zimbabwe seems to have operated through a system of tribute and redistribution. The king collected cattle, grain, and gold from subordinate communities across a wide area and redistributed this wealth in ways that maintained loyalty and authority. Key positions in the trading network would have been controlled by people close to the king, either family members or trusted allies. The ability to grant or withhold access to trade goods and to determine who benefited from the flow of gold and goods was a powerful tool for maintaining political control, and this system worked. For something like 2 centuries, from roughly 1250 to 1450, Great Zimbabwe was the dominant political and economic power across a vast stretch of southern Africa. Its influence extended several hundred kilometers in every direction. Smaller stone enclosures, built in the same architectural tradition, have been found across what is now Zimbabwe and into Mozambique and Botswana, almost certainly representing either satellite communities of the Great Zimbabwe polity or subordinate rulers who adopted the same architectural style as a statement of their political affiliation. At its height, this was one of the most powerful states in sub-Saharan Africa. It traded with China. It received goods from Persia. Its cattle herds were enormous. Its walls were the largest stone structures in sub-Saharan Africa south of the Sahara. By any reasonable measure, it was a civilization. And then, sometime in the 15th century, it ended. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe is not a dramatic story, not in the way that the sacking of Rome or the eruption at Pompeii is dramatic. There was no catastrophe we can point to, no single event that explains what happened. The people of Great Zimbabwe did not die, they left. And the question of why they left and where they went is one of the most compelling historical mysteries of the medieval African world. Let me walk you through the theories, because there are several, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first and perhaps most commonly discussed explanation is environmental collapse. The argument runs like this. Great Zimbabwe, at its peak, was home to 10,000 to 18,000 people, supporting that many people on the plateau required intensive agriculture and extensive cattle grazing. Over time, this would have placed enormous pressure on the surrounding landscape. Trees would have been cut for firewood and construction. Cattle would have grazed the grass down to bare earth in the areas immediately surrounding the city. The soil, stripped of its protective cover, would have been more vulnerable to erosion during the rainy season. And crucially, the farmland closest to the city, the farmland that the growing urban population depended on for food, would have gradually become less productive as centuries of intensive cultivation depleted the nutrients in the soil. There is archaeological evidence consistent with this interpretation. Pollen analysis from sediment cores taken from lake beds in the region shows a shift in vegetation over the relevant period, with signs of deforestation and changes in the plant communities that could indicate soil degradation. The evidence is not conclusive, and it is difficult to separate cause from effect, but the picture that emerges is at least consistent with a city that had pushed its local environment beyond what it could sustainably support. But there is a problem with this explanation if taken alone. If the land around Great Zimbabwe had become exhausted, that would explain why the city could not continue to grow, and might explain why people began leaving. But it does not explain why the center of power shifted dramatically northward, rather than simply declining gradually in place. And that is what seems to have happened. The power did not simply evaporate, it moved. Which brings us to the second explanation, which is political. And this one is more interesting, because it has to do with the gold. In the mid-15th century, the dominant power in what is now northern Zimbabwe was a kingdom called the Mutapa. The Mutapa state, sometimes referred to in historical sources as the monumental, after a Portuguese corruption of the title of its ruler, emerged as a major force in the region and seems to have competed successfully with Great Zimbabwe for control of the gold trade routes. The Mutapa had access to gold sources in the north and west that were, in some accounts, richer than those of the plateau around Great Zimbabwe. And crucially, the Mutapa seems to have established more direct relationships with the coastal traders, potentially cutting Great Zimbabwe out of the trading network that had sustained it for centuries. An economy built around trade is fragile in a specific way. It depends on being the necessary intermediary. If the traders can bypass you, they will, especially if going around you leads to better prices or safer routes. If Great Zimbabwe's position in the trading network was undermined, if the flow of coastal goods dried up while gold continued to be extracted and shipped out through new routes controlled by the Mutapa, then the economic rationale for the city's existence would have eroded. This theory is supported, at least in part, by Portuguese records from the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Portuguese traders, arriving on the East African coast in the 1490s, began writing about the gold trade and the powerful inland kingdoms they heard about. Their accounts mention the Mutapa repeatedly, and with great detail. They barely mention Great Zimbabwe at all. By the time the Portuguese arrived, the center of power had clearly already shifted northward. The great city was already diminishing. The third explanation is water. Some researchers have argued that a change in the rainfall patterns of the plateau could have played a significant role in the city's decline. The Zimbabwe plateau is not uniformly watered. The eastern regions tend to receive more rain than the western. Any shift in the distribution or timing of rainfall, whether caused by longer-term climate cycles or local environmental changes, could have disrupted the agricultural systems the city depended on. This argument is difficult to test with the evidence currently available, but it fits into a broader pattern of climate variability affecting complex societies across the world during the medieval period. The 14th and 15th centuries were a time of significant climatic instability in many parts of the world, and there is no particular reason to assume the Zimbabwe plateau was immune to this variability. And then there is a fourth possibility, one that is harder to document, but perhaps the most humanly understandable. Power shifts, dynasties fall, ambitious subordinates challenge their rulers and sometimes win. The history of complex societies is full of cases where political instability at the center triggered the kind of exodus that could empty a city. If the rulers of Great Zimbabwe lost the confidence of the regional elites who had been sending tribute and accepting the city's authority, the whole system could unravel quickly. Without the flow of tribute and trade goods, the city could not maintain its population. Without the population, the city could not maintain its position. It becomes a spiral. The most honest answer to the question of why Great Zimbabwe was abandoned is probably all of the above, at different times and in different proportions. Environmental pressure that made the local economy increasingly strained. Political competition from the north that undermined the city's trading position. Perhaps a period of bad rains. Perhaps a political crisis at the center that accelerated the departure of elites who then drew their clients and dependents with them. These forces do not operate in isolation. They interact with each other. They compound. What we know for certain is that by the mid-15th century, the population of Great Zimbabwe had declined dramatically. The stone enclosures were no longer being maintained. The great walls were not repaired when they crumbled. The conical tower stood in a city that was slowly emptying, like a clock left running in a house after everyone has moved out. And then the people left. Where did they go? This is the question that haunts the ruins most persistently. Because the people of Great Zimbabwe did not disappear. They were the ancestors of people living in southern Africa today. The descendants of the builders of these walls are, most likely, among the Shona-speaking peoples of modern Zimbabwe. But the specific question of where the inhabitants of the city itself went after its decline, what happened to the particular royal lineage that had ruled from the hill, what community they joined or founded when they left, is something we cannot trace with certainty. Some went north. The rise of the Mutapa kingdom drew people and power northward, and some of the population of Great Zimbabwe was absorbed into the growing Mutapa state, contributing their knowledge and their skills to a new center of power. The architectural tradition of stone enclosures continued in the north, and some of the stones enclosures associated with the early Mutapa period show clear stylistic similarities to Great Zimbabwe. Others may have gone west or south, joining other communities, dispersing into the landscape in smaller groups. In a pre-modern society where food production was the fundamental organizing principle, a family or a clan that could no longer be fed in one place simply moved to another. They brought their cattle, their seed grain, their pottery traditions, their stories, their sense of who they were. They absorbed into new communities or founded new ones. And within a few generations, the specific history of the city they had left became something their grandchildren knew only as a story. The Shona oral traditions contain references to the great stone houses, to the kings who ruled from the hills. But oral traditions change over time. Events get compressed or conflated. Specific details become symbolic references. The Great Zimbabwe of the oral tradition is a real place, but it is also a mythologized one, layered with meanings that have accumulated over centuries of retelling. The people who built Great Zimbabwe were not a mystery to themselves. They knew their own history. They passed it on in the way all pre-literate societies pass on history, in songs and stories and ceremonies, and the names they gave to places and people. What has been lost is not their history, exactly. What has been lost is our ability to access it. The specific records, the careful enumeration of kings and dates and events that historians rely on for the ancient world, those records do not exist for Great Zimbabwe, because the people of Great Zimbabwe did not write things down in a medium that survives. And this is where the mystery deepens into something more melancholy than simply a puzzle. We are not dealing with a lost civilization in the way that Atlantis is a lost civilization, a thing that may have never existed. We are dealing with a civilization that clearly existed, whose stones are still standing, whose artifacts are still being studied, but whose interior life, whose politics, whose religion, whose stories are available to us only in fragments and inferences. Let me tell you about what the ruins look like now, in the stillness of a late afternoon. The site is a national monument and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors can walk through the Great Enclosure, along the narrow passage between the inner and outer walls, into the open interior where the conical tower rises. The stone is grey and smooth and warm from the sun. In some places, you can see the lines where different periods of construction meet, where an older wall ends and a newer course of stone begins, in a slightly different style. The skill of the builders is evident in the regularity of the courses, the way the stones fit together without any binding material, the way the wall stands as straight today as it did when it was built. The hill complex is accessible by a path that winds up through the granite boulders. The climb is not long, but it is steep enough to make you breathe harder, and when you reach the top, you come out onto a wide view of the valley below, the ruins of the Great Enclosure, visible as a grey oval in the green, the surrounding countryside rolling away toward the horizon in every direction. Up here, on the hill, you can still see where walls were built to take advantage of the natural rock formations, incorporating the granite boulders themselves into the structure in a way that makes the boundary between natural and constructed almost invisible. You can see where the original drainage channels were cut into the stone. You can find, if you look carefully, the bases of the ancient darga floors where the king's household once stood. The valley below holds dozens of smaller enclosures, most of them reduced to low courses of stone barely visible above the grass. These were the homes of the elite, the court functionaries and priests, and wealthy traders who clustered around the power of the hill. In the rainy season, the grass between the ruins grows thick and green, and the whole site has a quality that is difficult to describe. Something between a garden and an archive, something between a monument and a memory. Birds live in the ruins, rock hyraxes, small furry mammals that look vaguely like rodents but are actually distant relatives of elephants, sun themselves on the walls. The slow life of the African bush goes on around the stones, as it has gone on for centuries, indifferent to the significance of what it inhabits. At dusk, when the last visitors have left and the guides have walked back toward the entrance, the site is quiet in a way that few places on earth are quiet. Not silent, because the bush is never truly silent, but quiet in the human sense. Empty of the particular noise of human occupation. And in that quiet, if you stand still in the Great Enclosure and look up at the conical tower against the evening sky, it is possible to feel something that is not quite grief and not quite wonder, but is some mixture of both. A sense of the weight of time, a sense of how much has been and how little remains. Now I want to talk about what happened when Europeans first encountered Great Zimbabwe, because that story is its own kind of historical tragedy, and it is directly relevant to why the mystery of the ruins persisted for so long and became so confused. The first European to visit the ruins and record a description of them was Karl Mauch, a German geologist and explorer who arrived in September of 1871. Mauch was not a terrible person by the standards of his time, but he was a man of his time, which means he carried a set of assumptions about Africa and African peoples that made it essentially impossible for him to see clearly what was in front of him. When Mauch stood in the ruins and looked at the walls, he did not think, "Here is evidence of a sophisticated, medieval African civilization." He thought, "Here is evidence that someone else was here." Someone from elsewhere, someone not African. His initial theory was that the ruins were the work of the Phoenicians, the ancient trading civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean. Later, the idea shifted to the Queen of Sheba. The biblical Queen of Sheba was associated by some scholars with the Horn of Africa, and the idea that Great Zimbabwe might be the site of her palace, or the biblical land of Ophir where King Solomon's gold came from, captured the Victorian imagination and would not let go for decades. This was not just an innocent misidentification, it had political consequences. The colonial powers, then establishing control over southern Africa, had a strong interest in finding ancient precedents for the idea that the land had been developed and civilized by outsiders, that African societies were inherently primitive and incapable of the kind of architectural and commercial sophistication the ruins represented. If Great Zimbabwe had been built by Phoenicians or Arabs or anyone other than the ancestors of the people currently living in the region, then colonialism was not the violent disruption of a functioning civilization. It was, instead, a continuation of some ancient pattern of outside intervention. This political interest in a non-African origin for Great Zimbabwe was not passive. In 1891, the British South Africa Company, Cecil Rhodes's commercial empire, took control of the region that would become Rhodesia. The ruins at Great Zimbabwe fell under their authority, and the company actively promoted and funded researchers who were trying to establish a foreign origin for the ruins, while suppressing or ignoring the work of researchers who reached different conclusions. One of the most extraordinary figures in this story is Richard Nicklin Hall, who was appointed as the official curator of Great Zimbabwe in 1902. Hall was not an archaeologist. He was a journalist and an enthusiast, and he was deeply committed to the theory that the ruins were the work of ancient Semitic traders rather than African builders. His method of investigation was essentially the opposite of archaeology. Rather than carefully recording everything he found in its original context, he removed material. He dug out what he considered to be the Kafir remains, that was his word, meaning the African artifacts, in order to search for the ancient material he was sure lay beneath. He destroyed an enormous amount of irreplaceable archaeological context in the process. The backlash from the professional archaeological community was significant. Gertrude Caton Thompson, a British archaeologist, was commissioned to conduct a proper scientific investigation of the ruins in 1929. Her excavations were methodical and rigorous. Her conclusions were unambiguous. Every piece of evidence she examined, the pottery, the artifacts, the stratigraphy, the construction techniques, pointed to a medieval African origin for the ruins. There was nothing Phoenician here, nothing Semitic, nothing from outside the African tradition. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe were built by the ancestors of the Shona, who were the majority population of the region and had been for centuries. Caton Thompson presented her findings to the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1931. She was, by all accounts, methodical and forceful and clear. Her evidence was not seriously disputed on its merits, and yet the non-African origin theories persisted in popular literature and colonial culture for decades, because the evidence was not really what those theories were about. They were about ideology, about the need to believe that sophisticated civilization in Africa required outside intervention. This history is important not just as a record of colonial intellectual distortion. It is important because it delayed the real scientific investigation of Great Zimbabwe by decades. The work that Hall destroyed cannot be recovered. The questions he prevented later researchers from answering remain unanswered. When the political pressure for non-African origins finally lifted, when Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980 and the country named itself after the ruins and publicly claimed them as a symbol of its pre-colonial civilization, the archaeological work that finally followed was decades behind where it should have been. We know less about Great Zimbabwe than we would have known if the first decades of investigation had been conducted honestly. That loss, too, is part of the mystery. Let me tell you a little more about the gold. Because the gold is really at the heart of everything, and I have not yet told you how it was found. Gold on the Zimbabwe plateau was extracted in several ways. The easiest and most ancient method was alluvial mining. panning river gravel for gold particles carried downstream from deposits in the bedrock. This required only a wooden bowl, a water source, and patience. It could be done by anyone, and it almost certainly was done by many people in small operations scattered across the plateau. But alluvial gold was finite, easily depleted. The bigger deposits were in the bedrock itself, in veins of quartz running through granite and other rock formations. Extracting gold from bedrock required a different technique. A fire was built against the rock face, heating it until it expanded. Then cold water was thrown onto the hot rock, causing it to crack. The cracked rock could then be broken further with iron tools, and the ore-bearing material removed and processed. This is called fire setting, and it is one of the oldest mining techniques in human history. It is also slow and difficult and dangerous, the kind of work done by people who had no other choice. The mines of the Zimbabwe plateau were worked for centuries, their shafts and tunnels sometimes reaching depths of 20 or 30 meters or more. Some of these ancient mine workings have collapsed over the centuries. Others survive. Dark, narrow passages in the rock that are still occasionally discovered by farmers or construction workers. The gold was smelted in clay crucibles, mixed with other metals to create alloys, and cast into shapes suitable for trade. Gold wire was a common form. Gold beads, thin sheets of beaten gold that could be worked into jewelry or applied to wooden objects in the way the rhinoceros of Mapungubwe was made. The gold that left the plateau for the coast arrived there in a form that Arab and Indian merchants could then melt down and rework for their own markets. The sheer volume of gold that left the Zimbabwe plateau over the medieval period is difficult to estimate, but it was substantial. Portuguese records from the early 16th century, when they were beginning to establish themselves on the East African coast and trying to understand the gold trade, suggest that the annual output of gold from the interior was in the range of several hundred to perhaps 1,000 kilograms per year. Over the centuries of Great Zimbabwe's dominance, this would have amounted to an extraordinary total. Much of that gold has long since been melted down and recast and melted again, scattered into the economies of a dozen civilizations. Some of it may still exist in the form of medieval Islamic or Chinese objects in museums and private collections, though we could never trace it back to its source. But some of the gold stayed, and some of that gold has been found. Archaeologists working at Great Zimbabwe and at related sites across the region have recovered gold objects of various kinds from excavations: beads, bangles, wire rings, thin sheets of hammered gold. These are not spectacular objects in the way that Tutankhamun's death mask is spectacular. They are small and sometimes plain, but they are real, and they are evidence of a society in which gold was not exotic but ordinary, a material used for everyday adornment and exchange, as well as for the special objects of ceremony and prestige. The concentration of gold objects in the excavations at Great Zimbabwe is highest in the areas associated with the ruling elite. The hill complex has yielded more gold than the valley enclosures, which in turn have yielded more than the surrounding areas. This distribution pattern is exactly what you would expect from a hierarchical society in which the control of gold was a key attribute of political power. The closer you were to the king, the more gold you had. I want to take a moment now and talk about something that the stones can't tell us directly, but that matters enormously for understanding what Great Zimbabwe was: the religious life of the city. We know, from comparative evidence and from later Shona traditions, that the people of Great Zimbabwe had a complex spiritual worldview, one in which the ancestors played a central role. The spirits of the dead, particularly the spirits of important people, rulers and elders, and founding figures, were believed to remain active in the world after death. They could intercede on behalf of the living, bring rain, ensure the fertility of crops and cattle, protect the community from enemies, but they could also withhold their favor, bring drought, allow illness to spread, if they were not properly honored. The ceremonies, the offerings, the prayers, the rituals of divination and propitiation, through which the living maintained their relationship with the dead, these were not marginal activities in the culture of Great Zimbabwe. They were central. The king's role as mediator between the living and the ancestors was, arguably, as important as his role as political and military leader. Perhaps more important, Because in a world where the rains might fail and the cattle might sicken and enemies might attack, what people needed more than anything was a sense that the forces governing their lives were not entirely beyond human influence, that there were things you could do, right things, proper things, to ensure the favor of the powers that determined your fate. The carved soapstone birds we discussed earlier may be the most direct material evidence we have of this spiritual world. They are clearly not utilitarian objects. They were found in context suggesting they were mounted on columns or poles, displayed prominently on the walls of the hill complex where the king lived and conducted ceremonies. The hybrid bird-human quality of their faces may suggest they were understood as intermediary beings, creatures that partook of both the human world and some other world beyond it, capable of moving between them in ways that ordinary beings could not. The Zimbabwe bird, as it is now known, has become a powerful national symbol. It appears on the flag of Zimbabwe, on banknotes, on official government seals. In a sense, it has traveled further from its origin than any of the gold that left the plateau through the trade routes. But what exactly it meant to the people who carved it and placed it on the walls of the hill complex 6 or 7 centuries ago, we can only approximate. There is a particular kind of humility required when approaching this kind of mystery. The temptation is always to fill in the gaps, to project meaning onto objects whose original meaning we cannot access. The carved birds might represent a rain-calling bird associated with the spirit of deceased kings. They might represent a cosmic intermediary between the human and divine worlds. They might represent something for which we do not have a ready category, something that belongs to a framework of understanding so different from our own that translation is not just imperfect, but impossible. The appropriate response to that kind of mystery is not to give up, not to simply say we cannot know and move on, but it is to hold your conclusions lightly, to say, this is our best current understanding, and it may be wrong, and we welcome the evidence that might change it. Now I want to slow down a little further and describe the act of approaching the ruins for the first time, because I think the physical experience of the place is worth dwelling on. You drive through the Zimbabwean countryside, through a landscape that is beautiful in a dry, spare way. Red earth roads and thorn trees, and granite outcroppings rising from the grass. The roads are not always smooth. There are long stretches where the tarmac has given way and you are on dirt, and the dust rises behind you in a long plume. Occasionally there are villages, small clusters of round thatched houses surrounded by maize fields, and children who wave as you pass. Occasionally there are cattle in the road, and you slow and wait for them to move, with the particular patience that cattle require. The Zimbabwe ruins, as they are sometimes called locally, announce themselves before you see them. You turn off the main road onto a smaller track, and then you are in a different kind of landscape, one that feels older and quieter. The trees larger, the grass longer, the air holding a particular density that is hard to explain but is immediately noticeable. There is a visitor center near the entrance, and a small museum with some of the excavated artifacts, and then a path that leads into the ruins themselves. The first thing you notice, approaching the Great Enclosure, is the wall. It appears through the trees gradually, grey against the green, and then you round a bend and it is simply there in front of you, enormous and still, and you stop without meaning to. It is not the height that gets you first, though the height is considerable. It is the texture. The surface of the wall is made of thousands of individual stones, each one cut and placed by human hands. And when you stand close enough, you can see the slight irregularities in each one, the way the hammer blows have left marks, the way some stones are placed slightly more neatly than others, evidence of individual workers doing their best with the tools and skills they had. You are standing in front of the accumulated work of generations of people, and you can, if you are quiet and paying attention, feel the weight of that. Inside the enclosure, the walls rise around you, and the noise of the outside world diminishes. The passage between the inner and outer walls is narrow, cool in the shade, the stone close on both sides. You come out into the main interior space, and there is the conical tower, and you stop again. It is not as tall as it once was. The top section has fallen at some point in the past 600 years, reduced by gravity and weather and the occasional tremor, but it is still imposing, and its shape is still distinctive, that gradual taper from a broad base to a narrower point, and the fact that it is solid all the way through gives it a quality of pure presence, of sheer insistent there-ness that is hard to look away from. You walk around it slowly. You touch the surface. The stones are warm from the sun. You look up at the walls surrounding the enclosure and try to imagine the space filled with people, with ceremony, with the smell of cooking fires and the sound of voices. You try to imagine what it would have felt like to stand here at the height of the city's power, surrounded by the evidence of what your civilization had built in a landscape your people had shaped for centuries. And then you walk out, and the ruins are behind you, and the birds are calling in the trees, and the moment closes like water closing over a stone. I want to tell you now about the period just before the abandonment, the decades when the city was still inhabited, but beginning to decline. Because this is perhaps the most human part of the story. Imagine living in a city that is slowly emptying. It does not happen all at once. In the early days of the decline, perhaps in the early to mid-15th century, what you notice is small things. The merchant caravans that used to arrive from the coast with glass beads and porcelain come less often. When they do come, they bring fewer goods. The exchange rates have changed, or the routes have shifted, or the merchants have found a better deal in the north with the mortar. You hear about this in the way people in any city hear about economic change. Through the gradual thinning of the market, the increased difficulty of obtaining things you used to take for granted. The fields outside the city walls have been farmed for generations, and the soil is tired in a way that the older farmers recognize. It takes more effort to get the same harvest. The cattle have grazed the near pastures down to bare earth, and the herders have to go further afield each season. There are murmurs about the rains, which have not been reliable in recent years. Everyone has their own theory about why. The powerful families, who have always occupied the best enclosures in the valley, begin to leave. They do not disappear dramatically. They move gradually, taking their cattle and their gold and their households northward toward the Mutapa territory, where the political winds seem to be blowing more favorably. Each departure is small enough to explain in practical terms, but the cumulative effect is a city that is becoming less. The walls of the Great Enclosure are not repaired when sections settle or slip. The daga plaster on the floors of the stone houses is not renewed. The market that used to fill the open space near the enclosure with the noise of trade is quieter. The religious ceremonies are still performed, but the attendance is smaller. The king, or whoever is exercising power in this final period, is dealing with a situation that is familiar in the history of cities everywhere. The logic of the place is no longer working, and there is no obvious way to fix it. People leave for reasons that are entirely rational, one family at a time. They are following the trade routes, following the cattle pastures, following the political opportunities, following the kin networks that have always told them where they belong. And as they leave, the city's ability to function declines further, which makes more people leave in a spiral that has no natural stopping point. At some moment, perhaps around 1450 or a little later, the last substantial community departed. The walls stood empty. The conical tower cast its shadow across an enclosure with no one in it. The sacred birds on their carved columns looked out over a valley that was returning to bush, the daga houses melting back into the soil, the paths between the enclosures being swallowed by grass. The ruins were not forgotten by the local population, of course. People continued to live in the surrounding region. They knew the stones were there. Some traditions say that the ruins retained a sacred character, even after the city had been abandoned, that certain ceremonies were still performed there, that the spirits of the ancestors lingered in the stone walls. If true, this would make the site something like a holy ruin, maintained in memory if not in occupation, a place you visited on specific occasions but did not live in. But the memory, without the written record to fix it in place, changed shape over the generations, as memories do. The specific names of the kings who had ruled from the hill, the particular history of how the city had grown and what had made it great, the details of the trading relationships and the political structures, these things became less specific over time. What remained was the sense of the place, the knowledge that something important had happened here, that the stones were not ordinary stones, that the ancestors lived in them in some way. There is something I want to say about why this mystery matters, and I want to say it carefully, because I think it is easy to miss. Great Zimbabwe is sometimes treated as a curiosity, a puzzle, an interesting piece of African history that deserves mention in a list of ancient wonders. But I think that framing misses the deeper significance of the place and its story. The story of Great Zimbabwe is, in part, a story about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, and why. The people who built these walls were participants in a global trading network that connected them to China and Persia and India. They were running a complex political economy that organized the production and distribution of gold across a vast region. They were building stone structures of a scale and precision that would not be seen in sub-Saharan Africa for centuries after their decline. They were, in every meaningful sense, a civilization. And yet, for decades after Europeans first encountered their ruins, the dominant explanation for those ruins was that they must have been built by someone else, by Phoenicians, by Arabs, by the Queen of Sheba, by anyone other than the people who actually built them. The reason for this is not mysterious. It was colonial ideology, the need to believe that African people were not capable of what the ruins demonstrated they were capable of. And the consequence of this ideology, beyond its inherent injustice, was that it delayed and distorted the historical inquiry that might have answered many of the questions we still have. We are still living with the intellectual consequences of those decades of distorted research. The mystery of where the people went and why the city was abandoned is a genuine historical puzzle. But it is not a puzzle born from a lack of human record-keeping or a lack of historical consciousness. It is a puzzle born from several centuries of a civilization existing primarily in oral rather than written tradition, which is a different kind of record, no less real but less durable, in the specific ways that modern historical investigation requires. And it is a puzzle compounded by a century of distorted and destructive inquiry, conducted in the service of colonial ideology rather than honest scholarship. When we say we don't know where the people of Great Zimbabwe went, we should also say we might know more if those first decades of investigation had been conducted differently. We should hold the mystery with that awareness, not as an excuse, not as a reason to give up, but as a part of the full truth of the situation. Let me tell you one more thing about the ruins before I let you drift towards sleep. There is a particular time of day to experience Great Zimbabwe, and it is the same time of day that suits all ancient places that have been long inhabited and long quiet. It is the late afternoon, when the light is coming from the side and everything casts a long shadow, and the heat of the day is beginning to ease, and the world seems to be exhaling. At that hour, the granite of the walls takes on a color that is almost golden. The shadow of the conical tower stretches across the floor of the enclosure in a long, dark line. The grass outside the walls moves in a light wind, coming across the plateau from somewhere in the east, somewhere over the mountains, somewhere toward the coast where the trade routes used to end. A bird lands on top of the wall and sits there for a moment, turning its head from side to side in the way birds do, looking at nothing in particular, or looking at everything. Then it opens its wings and is gone. The wall remains, 600 years after the last person lived inside it, 800 years after the first course of stone was laid by hands whose names we do not know, 1,000 years after the first gold was carried out of the plateau by people whose journey we cannot trace. The wall remains. There is something in that persistence that is worth sitting with. Not because the wall is famous or impressive or historically significant, though it is all of those things, but because it is there, and it was built by people who did not expect it to outlast them in quite the way it has. They built it for their own purposes, their own kings, their own ceremonies, their own daily life, in a city that was alive and noisy and full of the particular urgency of human beings going about their business. They did not build it to be a mystery, and it is one anyway, as almost everything made by human hands eventually becomes, when enough time has passed and enough has been forgotten, and the people who could have explained it have long since been gone. The silence after a story like this is its own kind of presence. You have been traveling. Not anywhere you can point to on a map, or not only there, you have been in the space where a city used to be, in the centuries when it was growing and in the decades when it was ending, in the slow pause after the last people left and before the first explorers arrived to misunderstand what they found. And now you are back here, wherever here is for you. In your bed, or on your couch, or in some quiet room where the night has settled around you and the screen is the only light. The walls are still standing. The tower is still there. The birds the ancient builders carved are in museums now, cleaned and lit and labelled, travelling further from home with each generation, but still carrying the same unknowable weight they carried when they were placed on the hilltop, overlooking the valley. The people who built them are, in the most literal and important sense, still here. They became other people, as all people do across time. They are in the faces of the people of Zimbabwe today, in the language those people speak, in the names of places across the plateau, in the ceremonies that survive in changed but unbroken form from the world that produced the stone enclosures. The city is gone. The civilization that produced it is not exactly. It simply changed into something else. As all living things eventually do, as all civilizations eventually do, what remains is the stone and the question and the long quiet of the African night settling over the ruins as the stars move in their ancient and indifferent paths overhead. Great Zimbabwe does not need to be fully explained to be fully honored. The mystery of where the people went is real, and it may never be completely resolved. But the people themselves were real. Their city was real. Their gold was real, and it traveled to places they never went, and furnished the palaces of emperors who never knew their names. Their walls are real, and they are still standing, waiting for the next visitor to come and stand before them and stop, involuntarily, in something that is not quite grief and not quite wonder, something in between, something that is the feeling of time. Sleep well. Carry the stones with you into whatever comes next. And in the morning, if you remember anything from tonight, remember this. They built something that outlasted everything except the question of who they were. And that, in its way, is a kind of immortality. End of script. But let us not stop yet. There is more to tell, and the night is long, and you are still here. We left the story at the moment of abandonment, at the quiet that settled over the walls when the last of the city's inhabitants walked away into the plateau and the grass began to grow over the floors they had polished. But that is not quite the end of what we know, and it is not the end of what is worth knowing. Let me go back, a little further, to the world that surrounded Great Zimbabwe at its height, because no city, no matter how powerful, exists in isolation, and Great Zimbabwe existed within a web of relationships that extended across the subcontinent and across the ocean, and understanding those relationships helps us understand what the city was and what its loss meant. The East African coast, in the 13th and 14th centuries, was one of the most cosmopolitan places on Earth. A string of small but prosperous port towns stretched along the coast from what is now Somalia in the north to what is now Mozambique in the south. These towns, collectively part of a cultural world that historians call the Swahili civilization, were governed by merchant elites who had grown rich on the Indian Ocean trade. Their inhabitants spoke Swahili, a Bantu language that had absorbed enormous quantities of Arabic vocabulary, a linguistic signature of the cultural fusion that centuries of contact had produced. Their mosques were built of coral stone and were architecturally sophisticated. Their pottery was decorated with Chinese motifs. Their rulers wore fine cloth imported from India and ate from vessels that had been shipped from Persian kilns. These were not primitive settlements. They were sophisticated commercial cities, and their wealth was built entirely on trade. The relationship between the coastal cities and the interior kingdoms like Great Zimbabwe was not simply one of supply and demand, of gold going out and glass beads coming in. It was a relationship with its own politics, its own diplomacy, its own dynamics of power and dependence. The coastal merchants needed the interior kingdoms to maintain the flow of gold and ivory and other trade goods. The interior kingdoms needed the coastal merchants to maintain access to the prestige goods, the imported luxuries that were a key part of how political authority was expressed and maintained. This mutual dependence was generally stable, but it was not permanent. When the trade routes shifted, when new power centers emerged in the interior, when political disruption on the coast affected the merchants' ability to operate, the whole system was vulnerable. And in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the system did shift. The Portuguese, arriving on the East African coast in the 1490s, would find a trading network that was already reorganizing itself, a world in which the old certainties of the gold trade were being renegotiated. But even before the Portuguese, the system had been under pressure. The Black Death of the mid-14th century, which devastated populations across Europe and the Middle East and disrupted trade networks across the known world, had ripple effects that may have extended all the way to the East African coast. The internal politics of the coastal city-states, which involved their own cycles of rise and decline, and the occasional violent overthrow of ruling families, sometimes disrupted the trade routes for years at a time. And the interior kingdoms were not passive recipients of these disruptions. They responded to them, adjusted to them, and sometimes were broken by them. The key coastal gateway for Great Zimbabwe's trade was the port of Sofala, and the key intermediaries were the Swahili merchants who operated out of the major coastal cities, particularly Kilwa, which in its heyday in the 14th century was one of the most wealthy and sophisticated cities in the Indian Ocean world. The Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who visited Kilwa in 1331, described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world, with fine mosques, a wealthy merchant class, and an active trade in gold that came from the interior. He did not know where the interior exactly was. He did not know about Great Zimbabwe, but the gold he saw being traded at Kilwa had almost certainly passed through that city's walls at some point in its journey. The connection between Kilwa's prosperity and Great Zimbabwe's prosperity was real, even though the two places were separated by more than 1,000 kilometers of savanna, river valleys, and mountain ranges. When Kilwa declined, as it did in the early 15th century due to internal political conflicts, the disruption was felt, in some form, all the way back on the plateau. I want to tell you about the cattle, because I have mentioned them several times, and I have not given them the attention they deserve. Cattle were not just an economic resource in the world of Great Zimbabwe. They were also a social language, a currency of relationships, a measure of worth in the most fundamental sense. The Shona word for cattle, mombe, appears in ceremonial contexts as well as practical ones. Cattle were sacrificed at important ceremonies. Cattle were paid as lobola, the bride wealth given by a man's family to the family of the woman he was marrying, a payment that was not about buying a wife, but about creating an alliance between families, acknowledging the woman's value, and creating a set of obligations and relationships that would bind the two families together. A man with many cattle was a man who had successfully navigated the social world, who had made the right alliances, who had demonstrated the kind of generosity and reliability that attracted supporters. A king with many cattle was a king who could reward loyalty, who could host the great ceremonial feasts that bound his followers to him, who could demonstrate the favor of the ancestors through the visible abundance of his herds. The relationship between cattle and political power was not incidental, it was structural. The king of Great Zimbabwe did not simply happen to own many cattle. He owned many cattle because owning many cattle was part of what it meant to be king. His herds were a visible sign of his authority. They were also, practically, a way of feeding his court, supplying the meat for the great ceremonies that legitimized his rule, and providing the animals that could be distributed as gifts to cement political relationships. Cattle grazing has always been one of the great transformers of African landscapes. A single head of cattle requires a considerable amount of grazing land to sustain itself. A herd of hundreds requires enormous pastures. A herd of thousands, which is what the ruler of Great Zimbabwe likely commanded at the city's height, requires the management of pastoral resources across a very large area. This management, the allocation of grazing rights, the control of water sources, the seasonal movement of herds to fresh pastures, was itself a form of political administration. Those who controlled the cattle routes controlled the landscape. And here is where the cattle and the environment story intersect in a way that is relevant to the question of why the city was abandoned. Intensive cattle grazing around a large settlement depletes the pastures. The grass does not recover quickly if there is no period of rest. The soil beneath the depleted grass becomes compacted and less able to absorb rain, which means more runoff and more erosion. The pastures near the city, which had been grazed for generations, would have been among the first to show signs of degradation. And degraded pastures mean thinner cattle, which means fewer calves, which means a slow reduction in the herd size that was central to the whole political economy. This is not speculation. It is the standard trajectory of intensive pastoral societies when they remain in one place long enough. The question is not whether this process occurred at Great Zimbabwe. The question is whether it occurred fast enough and severely enough to be a significant factor in the city's decline. And the honest answer is that we do not know for certain, though the circumstantial evidence suggests it played a role. Now, I want to take you somewhere else for a moment, to a place that helps us understand what Great Zimbabwe was by showing us what it influenced. In the Matabeleland region of western Zimbabwe, several days' journey from Great Zimbabwe by the standards of the medieval period, there are ruins called Kami. Kami was built by the Torwa dynasty, a political entity that rose to prominence in the Western Plateau after the decline of the Great Zimbabwe state. The people who built Kami were the same cultural tradition as the people who built Great Zimbabwe. They used the same dry stone construction techniques. They built the same kinds of stone enclosures. They had the same relationship with cattle and gold and the trade routes to the coast. But Kami is not Great Zimbabwe. It is smaller, more spread out across a larger area, the stone walls integrating more naturally with the landscape rather than forming the concentrated geometric statement of the Great Enclosure. The platform style of construction at Kami, where stone walls are built against hillsides to create level terraced platforms on which darga structures could be placed, is distinct from the freestanding enclosure style of Great Zimbabwe. It represents an evolution of the tradition, perhaps a response to the different landscape of the West, perhaps a reflection of different political priorities or aesthetic preferences. Kami was occupied from roughly the 15th to the 17th century. It was, in its time, a significant political centre. Portuguese traders who had established contacts on the Mozambican coast heard about Kami and the Torwa rulers who lived there, though they rarely visited in person. The Torwa remained powerful enough to maintain their own relationships with the coast, their own access to trade goods, their own cattle wealth, for 2 centuries after Great Zimbabwe had been abandoned. And then Kami too was abandoned, destroyed by a military force from the south. The Rosvi people, a Shona-speaking group associated with the Changamaya dynasty, swept through the Western Plateau in the late 17th century and took control of the region, destroying the Torwa state and building their own stone enclosures on the ruins of Kami. The stone tradition persisted. The specific powers that built the stones changed, and eventually, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the whole system was disrupted by the arrival of Nguni groups from the south, whose warfare and migrations transformed the political landscape of the plateau in ways that finally broke the continuity of the stone-building tradition. This long view, from Great Zimbabwe through Kami through the Rosvi to the eventual disruption of European colonialism, is important because it reminds us that the abandonment of Great Zimbabwe was not the end of a civilization. It was a moment in the longer history of a civilization that had many other moments, some more and some less successful, some well documented and some barely known. The stone tradition was not a unique achievement of one city. It was the characteristic expression of a whole cultural world that persisted for centuries after the great city fell quiet. Let me now tell you about the archaeology of ordinary life at Great Zimbabwe, because the archaeology of power and prestige is well documented, but the archaeology of daily life is equally interesting and rather less often discussed. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites, they find 2 broad categories of material. The first is the spectacular, the gold objects, the imported porcelain, the carved soapstone, the exotic beads. This is the material that gets photographed for museum catalogues and written about in popular histories. And it is genuinely important because it tells us about the external connections of the site, its economic reach, the status and wealth of its elite. But the second category is the ordinary, and this is in many ways more revealing about how people actually lived. At Great Zimbabwe, this ordinary material includes pottery made in the local tradition, simple, functional vessels, decorated with patterns, pressed into the clay before firing. It includes iron tools and weapons, hoes, axes, arrowheads, the everyday implements of a farming and herding economy. It includes grinding stones, the flat slabs of hard rock on which grain was processed daily, worn smooth and slightly concave from centuries of use. It includes animal bones, mostly cattle but also sheep and goats and wild animals hunted in the surrounding bush, and the charred seeds that tell us what crops were grown and eaten. The pottery is particularly useful because it is both abundant and distinctive. The ceramic traditions of the Zimbabwe plateau in the medieval period are well enough understood that archaeologists can look at a potsherd, a fragment of a broken pot, and tell you with reasonable confidence when it was made and by which cultural tradition. This allows them to trace the development of the site over time, to identify which areas were occupied earliest and which were added later, to track changes in the site's population and cultural affiliations. The pottery also tells us about cooking. The forms of the pots found at Great Zimbabwe include large storage vessels, medium-sized cooking pots, small serving bowls, and the distinctive forms associated with beer brewing. Sorghum beer was central to social life across southern Africa, as it has remained in many communities to this day. It was consumed at ceremonies. It was offered to ancestors. It was shared between neighbors in the context of cooperative work, where a group of people would gather to help one build a house or clear a field, and the host would provide beer as both refreshment and payment. The presence of beer pots in quantity at any archaeological site is a sign that the social life of the community was active and well organized. The grinding stones are a particularly evocative category of ordinary object. Grinding grain is hard work. It requires kneeling and pressing a handstone forward over a flat lower stone in a motion that is both physically demanding and rhythmically repetitive. In most African societies, it was traditionally women's work, done in the early morning before the day's other tasks began. The sound of grinding grain is a sound that was present in Great Zimbabwe every morning for centuries, part of the daily acoustic background of the city, along with the lowing of cattle and the crying of children and the sound of hammers on iron. These ordinary objects, the grinding stones worn smooth, the pots repaired with iron staples rather than thrown away, the arrowheads made from recycled iron, these objects speak of a life that was not defined by exotic goods and royal ceremony, but by the daily necessity of eating and working and maintaining the household and getting through the day. The people of Great Zimbabwe were extraordinary in what they built. They were ordinary in how they lived. And that ordinariness is what makes them most fully human to us. There is one more aspect of Great Zimbabwe that I have not yet properly addressed, and it is perhaps the most important context of all. The Zimbabwe plateau is not flat. It is a landscape of hills and valleys, granite outcroppings and river courses, woodland and grassland in a pattern determined by the underlying geology and the annual rainfall. To move across it is to move through a constantly changing landscape, one in which the route you take is determined by the geography, almost as much as by your destination. The paths between Great Zimbabwe and the other stone enclosures of the region were not straight lines. They followed the terrain, curved around the granite hills, descended into the valleys where the rivers ran, climbed back up onto the higher ground where the pastures were better. To travel between Great Zimbabwe and the nearest substantial stone enclosure might take 2 or 3 days on foot, longer in the rainy season when the rivers were running high and the paths were muddy. This scale of travel, days rather than hours, meant that the political authority of Great Zimbabwe over its wider sphere of influence was not exercised through constant direct contact. It was exercised through periodic visits, through the movement of tribute and trade goods, through the shared cultural and religious framework that gave the Great Zimbabwe polity its coherence. The local rulers in subordinate communities governed their own people most of the time, within a framework that acknowledged the authority of the center without requiring constant supervision from it. This kind of governance, which historians sometimes call a hegemonic polity or a prestige economy, is both flexible and fragile. It is flexible because it does not require the kind of intensive administrative apparatus that a centralized bureaucratic state requires. The center does not need to know the name of every village. It does not need to collect taxes in the detailed, systematic way that the Roman or Chinese empires did. It needs only to maintain the prestige and authority that keeps the tribute flowing and the subordinate rulers compliant. But it is fragile because that prestige and authority depend on things that can change. The flow of trade goods can be disrupted. A drought can undermine the sense that the king is maintaining the proper relationship with the ancestors. A military defeat can puncture the aura of invincibility, and once the fragility is exposed, the whole system can unravel with surprising speed, because there is no deep institutional structure holding it together. The subordinate rulers, who had been sending tribute, begin to hold it back. The merchants, who had been routing their trade through the center, find alternative paths. The whole edifice, which looked so solid from the outside, is revealed to have been built on something more like reputation than on coercive power. This is, I think, part of why the decline of Great Zimbabwe was as rapid as it appears to have been. The city did not shrink gradually over a century. It seems to have declined significantly within the course of a few decades in the mid-15th century. A polity organized around prestige can lose that prestige and contract dramatically in a way that a polity organized around military force or bureaucratic administration cannot. The logic works in reverse, as quickly as it worked in the first place. Let me now return to something I touched on earlier, the oral tradition, because I think it deserves more time than I gave it. The Shona-speaking people of Zimbabwe have maintained oral traditions that include references to the ruins and to the kings who ruled from them. These traditions are not simple myths or folk tales in the sense of being obviously fictional. They are, in many cases, the preserved memory of real historical processes, though that memory has been shaped and reshaped by centuries of transmission, and the specific details have been altered in ways we can only sometimes identify. The Shona possess a system of clan names and totems, a framework of identity that links the living to the ancestors through a chain of remembered names and relationships. This framework has been one of the primary vehicles through which historical memory has been maintained. When a Shona person identifies their clan totem, they are identifying their place in a genealogical network that reaches back, in some cases, centuries. But the specific memory of Great Zimbabwe in the oral tradition is not, as might be hoped, a clear historical record of who lived there and why they left. It is more fragmentary than that, more layered with later interpretation, more shaped by the purposes of those who transmitted it. Some traditions associate the ruins with a figure called Murenga or Mwari, a creator or sky deity who is important in Shona religious thought. Some traditions connect the ruins to specific royal lineages and their founding ancestors. Some traditions simply acknowledge the ruins as places of power, places where the spirits of the ancestors are particularly present. What the oral traditions do not provide is a clear narrative of the 15th century. Here is the political crisis. Here is the drought. Here is the moment when the last king made the decision to leave and led his people northward. That kind of precise historical memory, even in cultures with strong oral traditions, tends not to survive more than 4 or 5 generations with its specific details intact. What survives longer is the emotional and symbolic content of the memory. The sense of the place as important, the knowledge that great things happened there, the awareness that the ruins are connected to who we are and where we came from. This is not a failure of the oral tradition. It is simply the nature of oral memory, as different from written record as a river is different from a canal. A river carries everything, sediment and minerals and living creatures, and the memory of every rain that has fallen in its watershed. It does not keep records. A canal is deliberately constructed to carry a specific thing in a specific direction. Both are useful. Both have their limitations. Oral tradition is the river. The Shona oral tradition knows that Great Zimbabwe was important. It knows that the people who built it were the ancestors of people living on the plateau today. It knows that the ruins are sacred. What it does not know, in the way that a written chronicle would know, is the specific sequence of events that led to the abandonment. That knowledge was lost within a few generations of the abandonment, as the descendants of the city's inhabitants dispersed and merged with other communities, and the specific details were absorbed into the more general awareness that their people had once built something great. I want to take you now to a conversation that did not happen, but could have, sometime in the middle of the 15th century, somewhere on the Zimbabwe plateau, in the late afternoon of a day that was neither remarkable nor particularly ordinary. An old man is sitting outside the stone enclosure where he has lived for most of his adult life. He is not old by our standards, perhaps 50, perhaps a little more, but old by the standards of his time, old enough to have seen things change. He is watching his grandchildren play in the dust outside the enclosure wall, two small children chasing a dog that does not want to be caught. The light is the particular afternoon light of the plateau, coming from the west, making everything golden and long-shadowed. He has been thinking about leaving, not with panic, not with the urgency of crisis, but with the slow deliberateness of someone who has been watching the signs and is beginning to understand what they mean. The merchant caravans from the east have been less frequent. His neighbor's family, who had lived in the enclosure to the north for 3 generations, packed up their cattle and their grinding stones and their children 6 months ago and went north with the mutapa. His neighbor told him the mutapa was offering good land, better trade goods, a future that the plateau no longer seemed to offer. He did not argue. His own cattle are fewer than they were 5 years ago. The pasture to the west, where his grandfather used to graze a herd of 200, now barely supports 40 animals. The grass comes back thin after the dry season, and the rains this year were late and uneven. The senior men have talked about moving the herds further, to the valleys where the grass is still good, but that means being away from the enclosure for months at a time, which means leaving the women and children and old people with less protection. He looks at the walls of the enclosure. His grandfather's grandfather built those walls, or so the family story says. The stones were cut from the Kopje to the east and carried here by men who knew what they were doing, men who understood how to lay stone so it would stand without mortar. He has repaired sections of the wall himself. A fallen course here, a slipping face there. The walls are solid. They will outlast him. The question is whether they will outlast his children. He does not frame it that way to himself, exactly. But something like that thought is moving through the back of his mind as he watches the children play and the light changes and the cattle in the near pasture lift their heads one by one toward the smell of water from the river below. He knows the answer already, in the way that people usually know the answer before they let themselves think it clearly. He will stay one more season. He will watch the rains and the cattle and the sky over the eastern mountains where the caravans come from. And if next year is like this year, he will pack what can be packed, and he will walk north with his family and his cattle and whatever remains of the portable accumulation of several generations, and he will find somewhere else. And when he goes, someone, eventually, will close the gate of the enclosure for the last time. Or perhaps they will not bother, and the gate will simply stand open into a courtyard where no one lives anymore, open to the wind and the birds and the slow work of time. He watches his grandchildren catch the dog at last. The dog submits, panting, wagging. The children laugh. The sound carries across the courtyard and up the wall and out over the plateau, and for a moment it fills the air with something alive and certain and present. Then the moment passes, as moments do. The Portuguese arrived on the East African coast at the very end of the 15th century, in the 1490s, and their arrival changed everything about the world the coastal trading cities had built. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 and 1498, and the Europeans who followed him were not primarily interested in trade on the terms that the existing system offered. They were interested in control. They wanted to dominate the Indian Ocean trade routes, not participate in them as equals. What followed over the next century was a gradual, often violent dismantling of the Swahili trading network that had sustained the interior kingdoms for centuries. The Portuguese bombarded coastal cities that refused to cooperate. They established their own trading posts, protected by warships, and attempted to route trade through these posts rather than through the existing Swahili merchant networks. They extracted tribute by force where they could not attract it through commerce. This disruption of the coastal trading network had consequences for the interior, though by the time the Portuguese arrived, Great Zimbabwe had already been declining for decades. The Mutapa Kingdom, which had inherited much of Great Zimbabwe's trading position, dealt with the Portuguese in its own way, sometimes negotiating, sometimes fighting, often playing different factions within the Portuguese colonial apparatus against each other. The relationship between the Mutapa and the Portuguese is a complex story in its own right, one that stretched over 2 centuries and involved extraordinary maneuvering on both sides. But the effect on the broader culture of the Zimbabwe plateau was real. The gold trade, which had driven the development of the stone enclosure tradition and the complex political economy that produced Great Zimbabwe, was disrupted and transformed by the Portuguese presence. The profits that had once flowed to interior kingdoms were increasingly captured by European intermediaries. The goods that came back from the coast changed in character, cheaper mass-produced items replacing the luxury craft goods that had once been the prestige currency of the plateau elite. The whole system that had sustained Great Zimbabwe was being dismantled piece by piece from the coast inward. By the 17th century, when the first written descriptions of the ruins began to circulate among Europeans on the coast, Great Zimbabwe had been empty for 200 years. It had become, in the Portuguese accounts that mentioned it, a kind of legend, a place reported by African traders who had heard about it from other African traders, a city of stone somewhere in the interior where gold came from. The Portuguese never visited it. They had no reason to. The gold that came through their trading posts was more immediately interesting than the ruined city that had once organized its production. And so, the ruins waited, as they had been waiting since the last inhabitants left, in a silence that was not empty but full of the accumulated weight of what had happened there and the gathered absence of everything that was gone. There are things I want to tell you that are harder to source, harder to ground in specific archaeological evidence, but that feel true in the way that some things feel true before you can fully explain why. The people of Great Zimbabwe must have loved their city. Not in the way we talk about loving a city now, with all the self-conscious sentiment that the word implies, but in the way that people love the place where they were born, where their parents are buried, where their children took their first steps, where the particular angle of the morning light over the eastern wall is a thing so familiar it is barely noticed, just part of what the morning is. People do not build walls a meter thick and 11 meters high because they are indifferent to the place where they live. They do not work with that kind of precision and that kind of dedication for something they do not care about. The care is in the work. You can see it in the way the courses of the outer wall are laid, each stone chosen and placed with attention, the surface that results not merely functional but genuinely beautiful. And when they left, they must have looked back. You cannot leave a place that matters without looking back, even if you know you are not coming back, even if the reasons for leaving are overwhelming, even if the place is no longer what it was. You look back. What they saw when they looked back was the walls rising above the grass, the conical tower visible above the enclosure wall, the hill with its crown of ancient stone. It was still there. It was still, in its way, magnificent, just empty, just no longer theirs, in the active sense of belonging to them. No longer the place where they woke up and fed their cattle and ground their grain and argued and celebrated and mourned. The world they walked toward was uncertain. The world they were leaving was known, even if it could no longer sustain them. That tension between the known place that cannot hold you and the unknown place that might is one of the most human experiences there is. It does not require a particular culture or a particular century. It is simply the experience of having to leave. The night sky over the Zimbabwe plateau is extraordinary. I say this not as a poetic flourish, but as a simple fact with historical relevance. In a world without artificial light, the stars were not the faint pinholes we see from cities today. They were enormous, overwhelming, so numerous and so bright that the Milky Way was not a vague smear but a structure you could almost reach toward, a river of light across the dark. The people of Great Zimbabwe, like all pre-modern peoples, navigated by the stars, travelers moving between enclosures at night, or herders watching over their cattle in the hours before dawn, had the full sky available to them as both map and clock. The position of particular stars above particular hills told you where you were. The progression of the night sky told you how many hours had passed. The appearance of certain star groupings at certain positions told you what season was coming. But the stars were more than navigational tools. They were part of the world, as the people of the plateau understood it, a world in which the boundary between the natural and the spiritual was not as sharp as we tend to draw it. The movements of celestial objects, the phases of the moon, the rising and setting of particular stars, were connected to the rhythms of the agricultural calendar and the ceremonial calendar in ways that blurred any simple distinction between science and religion. We do not know what the people of Great Zimbabwe called the stars, what stories they told about them, what ceremonies were timed by their movements. The oral traditions that survive are not specific enough to give us that level of detail about the medieval period. But we know that the connection between the sky and the earth, between celestial events and human obligations, was fundamental to the worldview of Bantu-speaking peoples across sub-Saharan Africa. The stars were not background, they were part of the foreground of life. When the city was inhabited, the hill complex at the top of the kopje would have been one of the best places on the plateau to observe the sky. Elevated above the valley, free from the smoke of the cooking fires below, with a wide view in every direction, it was a natural observatory, a place where whoever had the responsibility for watching the sky could do so without obstruction. Whether the Zimbabwe rulers had someone whose specific task this was, whether there was something like a court astronomer or a priestly specialist in celestial observation, we do not know. But the position of the hill complex and the general importance of celestial timing in the agricultural and ceremonial life of the plateau suggests that someone was watching. And now the hill is empty, and the stars continue their movement above it, as they did when the city was alive, as they will do when the walls themselves have finally crumbled back to the ground from which they were raised. Here is a detail that has always stayed with me, a small thing found in the archaeological record that feels, somehow, like a window into something true about the people who lived here. Among the objects recovered from the excavations at Great Zimbabwe are small clay figurines. Most of them are cattle figurines, which is not surprising given how central cattle were to the culture. But some of them are human figures, simple and somewhat abstract, made by hands that were clearly not trying to produce fine art but something more personal and immediate. Some of these figurines appear to have been made by children. The evidence is in the fingerprints left in the clay before it dried. Small fingerprints, the fingerprints of small hands, the hands of children who were sitting in the courtyard of a stone enclosure 700 years ago, making things from clay, the way children make things from clay everywhere in the world, because it is there, and it is malleable, and it does what your hands tell it to do. When I think about Great Zimbabwe, I think about those fingerprints, not because they are historically significant in the way that the soapstone birds are historically significant, or in the way that the construction of the outer wall is historically significant, but because they are human in the most immediate possible way. A child pressing its fingers into wet clay on a morning in the 14th century, in a city that would be empty within 100 years. A child who did not know that and could not know that. A child who was just making something in the particular absorbed silence of children at play. That child grew up, had children of its own probably, perhaps left when the city began its decline, perhaps told stories to those children about the enclosure where they had lived, about the walls and the tower and the morning light on the stones. Perhaps those children told stories to their own children. Perhaps something of that chain of telling survives, transformed beyond recognition in the oral tradition of the Shona people today. Or perhaps not. Perhaps that particular thread of memory was broken somewhere along the line and is gone, like the vast majority of what was thought and felt and made by ordinary people in the medieval world, everywhere in the world, not just here. The fingerprints are what we have, pressed into clay that dried and hardened and was buried and survived 600 years in the earth, waiting. Let me now tell you about the seasons, because the seasons shaped everything about the life of the city and are part of the rhythm that makes it feel real and livable. The Zimbabwe plateau has two main seasons, a wet season and a dry season. The wet season runs roughly from November to March, the summer months in the southern hemisphere. During this time, the rain comes most afternoons as heavy thunderstorms that build from the east during the morning and break over the plateau in the afternoon with dramatic intensity. The lightning is spectacular. The thunder rolls between the granite kopjes and echoes back on itself in a way that can be disorienting. The rain falls in sheets and runs off the hard-baked earth in rivers that disappear almost as quickly as they come, draining into the soil or running off down the rocky hillsides. After the rains, the plateau transforms. The grass that was gold and dry becomes green and lush within days. The red soil exhales a smell that is the most particular smell in the world, petrichor, the smell of rain on dry earth, the smell of the season turning. The animals that had been thin from the dry months recover. The cattle find rich grazing. The farming households plant their sorghum and millet, pressing the seeds into the wet earth in the knowledge that the rains will carry them through to harvest. The dry season, from roughly May to October, reverses everything. The rain stops, the grass dries back to gold, the rivers shrink to trickles or stop altogether. The air becomes clear and dry and cold at night in the months of June and July, genuinely cold in a way that surprises people who think of Africa as always hot. Frost is not uncommon on the higher parts of the plateau in midwinter, and the days are bright and still, the sky an impossible blue, the landscape beautiful in its dryness in a way that it is not beautiful when green. The dry season was the season of travel, of cattle drives to distant pastures, of the movement of trade caravans that found wet season mud too difficult for heavily loaded porters. It was the season of building, of cutting stone and carrying it without the interruption of afternoon rains. It was the season of festivals and ceremonies, of political gatherings that brought the surrounding communities to the city in numbers that the wet season roads could not have supported. And it was the season when the sky was clearest at night, when the stars burned with their full intensity in the dry air, when the Milky Way was at its most overwhelming, when you could watch Jupiter move slowly across the sky over the course of weeks and feel, if you were inclined to think about such things, the turning of something larger than any human concern. The city breathed with the seasons. The wet season was for farming and building and staying close to home. The dry season was for movement and trade and ceremony and the reassertion of political authority through the gatherings and redistributions that kept the whole system functioning. This rhythm, repeated year after year for 2 centuries, was the heartbeat of the city. And when the heartbeat stopped, when the gatherings became smaller and the redistributions less generous and the trade caravans came less often, the silence between the beats grew longer until there was only silence. I want to end this section with the rain, because the rain was the most fundamental element of life on the plateau, and because the relationship between the ruler and the rain was one of the most important relationships in the political world of Great Zimbabwe. The king was a raincaller, not in the sense that he performed magic tricks or operated supernatural machinery, but in the sense that his relationship with the ancestors, his proper maintenance of the ceremonial obligations that kept the spiritual world in alignment with the human world, was understood to be the primary mechanism through which the rains came. In a farming and herding economy entirely dependent on reliable rainfall, the rain was not just weather, it was fate. A good rainy season meant full granaries and fat cattle, and the social ease that comes with abundance. A bad rainy season meant hunger and thin cattle, and the particular anxiety that comes from watching the sky for clouds that do not come. The rain ceremonies of the plateau, some of which survived in changed form into the modern era and have been documented by anthropologists, were elaborate affairs. They involved the entire community. They involved the ancestors. They involved the sacrifice of cattle and the pouring of beer. They involved singing and dancing and the particular concentrated attention of a community asking for something it desperately needs. And at the center of these ceremonies, performing the key ritual acts, maintaining the connection between the living and the dead that the rain required, was the king. If the rains came, the king had done his job. If the rains failed, the question of whether the king was still properly aligned with the ancestors was a political question as much as a religious one. Failed rains were a sign that something was wrong, and the king was the most obvious thing that could be wrong. There is a terrible feedback loop possible here. If the rains failed, the king's authority could be questioned. If the king's authority was questioned, the tributary system through which he maintained his wealth could be disrupted. If the tributary system was disrupted, the redistributions that demonstrated his power could not be made. If the redistributions could not be made, the subordinate ruler's loyalty waned. If their loyalty waned, the whole system weakened. And a weakened king calling weakened rain ceremonies in a drought year faced the possibility of complete political collapse. We do not know if something like this happened at Great Zimbabwe in the years before the abandonment, but we know it was possible. We know the logic was built into the system, and we know the rains were, in those decades of the mid-15th century, likely unreliable. The pieces are there. By now, you may be drifting. Your breathing has probably slowed. The details of this story are moving through your mind in the particular way that stories move through a mind that is releasing its grip on consciousness, becoming images more than ideas, sensations more than arguments. That is as it should be. The walls are still standing. The conical tower is still there in the dark. The granite kopje, where the king's enclosure sat, rises above the valley, and the stars move above it as they have moved for 600 years of abandonment and 200 years before that of occupation, an indifferent and beautiful clock measuring out the nights in a country that named itself after the ruins. The mystery remains, not because no one has tried to solve it, but because the evidence for a complete solution does not exist and may never exist. We have the stones, and we have the artifacts, and we have the fragments of oral tradition and the Portuguese records that mention the interior kingdoms without having visited them. We have the pollen cores from the lake beds and the bones of cattle in the middens and the fingerprints of children in dried clay. We have a beautiful, meticulous, heartbreaking amount of evidence about a civilization that no longer exists in the form it once took, that has instead dissolved into the people and the landscape and the stories of southern Africa, distributed and transformed and continuing. And we have this, the walls, still standing after 600 years, built without mortar by people who knew what they were doing and cared about doing it well, built in the service of kings whose names we have lost, built to last, which they have done. The people of Great Zimbabwe did not know we would be thinking about them. They did not build for posterity in the way that some rulers build, with one eye on how they will be remembered. They built for themselves, for their own present, for the political and ceremonial needs of a living civilization. And by accident, by the simple fact that stone lasts longer than daga, and longer than memory, and longer than kingdoms, they left us something. Not everything. Not the names. Not the stories. Not the sound of the city on a busy market day, or the smell of the rain hitting the stone walls, or the particular note of the voice of the king addressing his court in the language of his ancestors. Those things are gone, but the walls are here, and on a late afternoon when the light is right, they are enough to feel the full weight of what was lost and what remains. Sleep, now, if you are ready. You have been to a place that is 600 years quiet, and the silence of it is in you now. The red earth of the plateau, the granite walls, the conical tower casting its shadow across an empty courtyard, the stars above the hill complex, moving as they have always moved. The people who built these walls are not entirely gone. They became other people, as all people do. They are in the land, and in the language, and in the stories that are still told around fires on the plateau on winter nights, when the sky is full of stars, and the ancestors are present, as they have always been, in the breathing dark. You carry something of them now too, just from having spent this time in their story. History works that way. It deposits things in you that you did not have before, small most of the time, but real. Rest well, the walls are still standing, and somewhere on the plateau tonight, the stars are burning above the empty enclosure, as they have burned on every night since the last fire went cold, waiting for the morning as they always do, as they always will. But I am not ready to leave you yet, and I suspect you are not quite ready either, or you would already be gone. There is more to the story of Great Zimbabwe than the walls and the gold, and the question of where the people went. There is the story of what the ruins have meant to different people at different times, and that story is itself a kind of history, layered and complicated and worth knowing. We talked about Karl Marx and his arrival in 1871. We talked about the colonial need to deny African authorship of the ruins, but I want to go deeper into what that denial looked like in practice, because the details are more specific and more interesting than the general principle suggests. The theory of Phoenician or Semitic origin for Great Zimbabwe was not simply an idle fantasy entertained by a few eccentric scholars. It was actively promoted, funded, and enforced by the colonial government of Rhodesia. In 1905, the British South Africa Company appointed a committee to investigate the ruins. The committee was stacked with people who favoured the Semitic origin theory. Researchers who challenged this theory found their access to the site restricted. their publications suppressed or ignored, their careers affected by their willingness to follow the evidence rather than the ideologically preferred conclusion. This is worth saying clearly. The colonial government of Rhodesia suppressed the truth about Great Zimbabwe for decades because the truth contradicted the ideology that justified their occupation of the country. They needed Great Zimbabwe to have been built by someone other than African people. Because if it had been built by African people, then the whole premise of the civilizing mission, the idea that European colonialism was bringing civilization to a benighted continent, was exposed as the lie it was. Gertrude Caton Thompson's 1929 investigation and her unequivocal conclusion that the ruins were built by African people in the medieval period was not simply an academic discovery. It was a political act. Publishing it, defending it against the objections of people who had strong institutional and ideological reasons to reject it, required courage. She did it anyway, and she was right. But the story does not end with Caton Thompson. Even after her work, even after the professional archaeological consensus had been established, the Rhodesian government continued to promote alternative theories in popular culture. When the first guidebooks for tourists visiting the ruins were produced, they were careful to avoid stating plainly that the ruins had been built by the ancestors of the Shona people who lived around them. They described the origins as uncertain or speculated about ancient civilizations whose identity could not be definitively established. This was not honest uncertainty, it was politically motivated obfuscation, and it worked up to a point. Through the middle decades of the 20th century, many people in Rhodesia and in the wider English-speaking world believed, because they had been told to believe, that the origins of Great Zimbabwe were genuinely mysterious in a way that the archaeological evidence had long since resolved. When Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980, one of the first things the new government did was to name the country after the ruins and to publicly, proudly claim the ruins as a symbol of pre-colonial African civilization. The Zimbabwe bird from the hill complex became the centerpiece of the national flag. The country's name, chosen from among several options, was a declaration. We are the people of the stone houses. This is our history. These are our ancestors. It was an act of reclamation, and it was profoundly meaningful to the people who had been denied that history for so long. But the decades of distorted and destructive inquiry had done real damage. The archaeological record of Great Zimbabwe is less complete than it should be because of what Hall did in the early 20th century. The questions we most want to ask, about the political structure of the kingdom at its height, about the specific events of the decline, about the interior lives and spiritual beliefs of the people who lived there, are harder to answer because so much of the evidence was destroyed or damaged or never properly recorded. This is a loss that cannot be fully calculated. It is not simply the loss of data, though it is that. It is the loss of the specific, unrepeatable details that would have allowed us to know these people more fully, to hear their voices more clearly, to understand their world from the inside rather than always from the outside, inferring and approximating and making educated guesses. We are left with what we have, and what we have, though incomplete, is extraordinary. The walls, the artifacts, the bones of cattle and the fragments of pottery, and the pollen from ancient lake beds, and the gold beads, and the Chinese porcelain, and the carved soapstone birds, and the fingerprints of children in dried clay. These things are enough to build a partial understanding, a sketch rather than a portrait, an approximation of a world that was fully realized and fully human. I want to take a moment to think about what we mean when we say a civilization was lost. Great Zimbabwe is sometimes described as a lost civilization, and I have used similar language in this script, but I want to complicate that a little, because I think the framing of lost can mislead us about what actually happened. A civilization is not a thing that can be lost the way a set of keys can be lost. It is a living process, always changing, always adapting, always in the middle of becoming something else. When Great Zimbabwe declined as a center of power, the people who had been part of it did not cease to be part of a civilization. They continued to live, to farm and herd and trade, and perform ceremonies, and make pottery and raise children. They carried the specific cultural knowledge and social practices that the city had fostered with them into the new communities they joined or created. The architectural tradition of stone enclosures persisted. The ceramic tradition evolved and continued. The relationship with cattle and gold and the trade routes adapted to new circumstances. The Shona language that the people of Great Zimbabwe spoke is still spoken today by millions of people in forms that have changed but are recognizably continuous with the medieval version. What was lost was the specific form of the civilization, the particular political structure centered on the great city, the specific trading relationships, the particular expression of religious authority that the carved birds and the hill complex enclosure represented. What was not lost was the people themselves and the accumulated knowledge and practice and identity that they carried with them. This distinction matters because the lost civilization framing can make it seem as if there is a break, a discontinuity, a point at which something ended and nothing followed. But there is no such break. The people who built Great Zimbabwe became the people who built Kami and the Rosvi stone enclosures and the communities that Portuguese travelers described in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the Shona and Ndebele communities of the 19th and 20th centuries, and the people of Zimbabwe today. The stone is what is lost, in the sense of no longer being used. The people are what continued. When we say we don't know where the people went, we should be more precise. We don't know the specific routes they took and the specific communities they joined in the immediate aftermath of the city's decline. But in a broader sense, we know exactly where they went. They went into the history of the people of southern Africa. They are still there. There is a stone in the hill complex at Great Zimbabwe that I have not mentioned yet, and I want to mention it now because it is, in its way, as significant as the outer wall of the Great Enclosure, or the conical tower, or the carved soapstone birds. It is not a large stone, or an especially impressive one. It is a flat piece of granite, embedded in the floor of one of the enclosures on the hill, with two slight depressions worn into its surface. The depressions are smooth and round, worn by what must have been thousands of repetitions of the same motion over many years. They are the marks left by the act of grinding. Someone, or many someones over many years, knelt on this stone and ground grain on this surface, pressing a handstone back and forth in the motion that is the oldest daily task of settled human life. They were not the king. They were not a priest, or a trader, or a political official. They were whoever had the job of grinding the grain for whoever lived in the enclosure on the hill. A woman, most likely, as grinding was women's work in this tradition, perhaps more than one woman, over the years and decades that the marks accumulated. She ground grain here every morning. She knelt on this stone and worked the handstone back and forth and listened to the sound of the stone on stone and smelled the dust of crushed grain and felt the particular ache in her back and shoulders that this work always produced. She was not performing history. She was feeding people. She was doing what needed to be done. And 600 years later, her work is still visible. The stone remembers her, the way stone remembers the things that happened to it, without judgment, without narrative, without any meaning beyond the simple fact of the impression. That is what history is, at its most fundamental. Impressions left in stone, not the grand claims of kings, or the religious aspirations of priests, or the ambitious constructions of builders, not the gold that traveled across the ocean, or the porcelain that came back in exchange. Those things matter, but they are not more real than the two smooth depressions in a flat piece of granite, where a woman knelt every morning for years and ground the grain that fed the people who made all those other things possible. She has no name in the historical record. She will never have one. But she was there, and the stone knows it, and now you do too. I want to take you now through the archaeology of the site, one more time, more slowly, paying attention to the things that are easy to overlook when you are focused on the grand and the spectacular. The valley between the hill complex and the Great Enclosure contains dozens of smaller stone enclosures, most of them reduced by time to low walls, barely visible above the grass. These are the enclosures of the elite, who lived in the shadow of the king's residence, the families and officials and specialists who constituted the inner circle of the city's political and religious life. In the excavations of these valley enclosures, archaeologists have found the densest concentrations of imported goods anywhere at the site. More Chinese porcelain here than anywhere else, except the hill complex itself. More imported glass beads. More fragments of decorated cloth that had been traded up from the coast. These were the households that benefited most directly from the city's trading position, the people whose lifestyle depended most directly on the flow of goods from the Indian Ocean world. But they also found more mundane things. Worn-out hoe blades, the iron worn thin by years of use in the fields. Broken clay pots mended with iron staples, the ancient equivalent of duct tape, keeping a vessel functional long past the point where a wealthier household might have replaced it. Even among the elite, even among the people with access to Chinese porcelain, the daily necessities of life were maintained with the same careful economy that characterized households everywhere in the pre-modern world. Things were repaired rather than replaced. Iron was recycled and reforged. Clay pots were used until they could not be used anymore. This frugality is not what we expect when we think of the wealthy ruling class of a major medieval trading city. But it makes sense when you remember that Great Zimbabwe was not a cash economy in the modern sense. The goods that flowed through it were specific and often bulky. You could not simply go to a market and buy a new hoe with a fraction of your gold. The distribution of goods was controlled and ceremonial as much as commercial. Having gold or access to trade goods did not automatically translate into the ability to replace everyday household items on demand. The everyday items were produced locally by local craftspeople, according to local traditions, and they were maintained and repaired as long as they could be. Further out in the valley, in the areas where the ordinary population lived, the archaeological record is sparser. The daga houses have dissolved. The objects found are simpler, more pottery of the local tradition, less imported material, more agricultural tools, more evidence of food processing. The further you get from the center of power, the more the archaeology looks like the archaeology of a farming village, and the less it looks like the archaeology of a trading city. This is exactly what you would expect from a society with the kind of hierarchical structure that Great Zimbabwe had, where access to prestige goods and imported luxuries was a privilege of position and not evenly distributed. But even in the outermost areas of the city, there are traces of the connection to the wider world. A single glass bead in a midden, a fragment of a vessel that might have been traded down from an elite household to a less elite one, as the vessel aged and chipped and became less fit for display. The goods circulated. They did not stay fixed at the level where they entered. They moved down through the social hierarchy as they aged, just as they moved up through the tribute hierarchy when they arrived. The river below the site has a name in Shona. The site itself has a name. The landscape has names that have been in use for centuries, accumulating the histories of all the events that happened in it. When you walk through the bush around Great Zimbabwe, you are walking through a named landscape, a landscape whose names encode the memory of what happened there, even when the specific content of that memory has changed. This is one of the ways in which oral cultures maintain historical knowledge, through place names. A place name that encodes a historical reference, even when the story behind the name has been forgotten, marks the landscape with the fact that something happened there. Future generations who use the name without knowing its origin are still, in a sense, keeping the memory alive, though in a changed and compressed form. The landscape around Great Zimbabwe is full of such names. Hills named for the events that happened on them, valleys named for the animals or the seasonal activities associated with them. Rivers named for qualities of the water or for the people who once lived beside them. These names are a kind of distributed archive, scattered across the landscape rather than concentrated in any single document or site. Some of these names are specifically associated with the ruins. Some encode memories that are more ancient than the stone enclosures, memories of the landscape before the city was built, when the granite kopjes were simply features of the terrain rather than the foundations of walls. Others encode memories of the city itself, of events that happened during the centuries of its occupation, though the specific content of those memories is now available to us only in the most general terms. The relationship between a people and a named landscape is one of the most intimate relationships there is. When the people of Great Zimbabwe left, they carried the names of the places they had known with them in the stories and songs and practical knowledge that they took into their new lives. And the landscape they left kept their names attached to it, waiting for people who would know what those names meant, or eventually for people who would use the names without knowing, which is its own kind of keeping. I keep returning to the moment of departure, because I think it is the most humanly vivid part of the story, and because I have not yet fully done justice to how gradual it must have been. Cities do not empty all at once. They empty in stages, over years, and sometimes decades. The first to leave are those with the least to lose, or the most to gain from going. Often this means the poor, often this means the young, who have not yet built the networks of obligation and relationship that make leaving costly. Sometimes it means the wealthy, who can afford to make the journey and establish themselves somewhere new. At Great Zimbabwe, the pattern of departure seems to have been from the elite outward. The powerful families with extensive cattle herds and trading connections had the most reason to follow the trade routes north, and the most means to do so. Their departure set a precedent and also weakened the social fabric that kept everyone else in place. When the patrons leave, the clients have less reason to stay. When the wealthy households that formed the core of the local economy stop buying, the craftspeople who supplied them have less reason to stay. When the ceremonies that justified and reproduced the political authority of the place become attenuated, the people who depended on participation in those ceremonies for their own status and identity have less reason to stay. And then there is the simple question of safety. A city whose elite has departed, whose walls are no longer fully maintained, whose political authority no longer extends protectively over the surrounding region, is a more dangerous place than it was. Raiding, the taking of cattle and grain, and people by outside groups taking advantage of weakened defences, was a constant risk in the pre-modern world. A weakening city was an invitation, and the people who remained as the city declined were increasingly vulnerable to the attention of those who saw the vacancy as an opportunity. This does not mean the final abandonment was violent. There is no evidence in the archaeological record for a violent destruction of Great Zimbabwe. No burning, no mass casualties, no signs of battle. The city seems to have been left, not attacked. But the context of its leaving was one in which staying was increasingly costly in terms of both economic opportunity and physical safety, and going was increasingly rational. The last people who left Great Zimbabwe probably did not think of themselves as the last. They probably thought of themselves as the latest in a sequence of departures, the ones who had held on longest, who had been most reluctant to leave, who had the most deeply rooted reasons to stay. They may have left intending to return when things got better, the way people always do when they leave a place they love under compulsion. They may have told themselves they were going for a season or a year, and that when the rains came back or the trade routes reopened, they would come home. But the rains did not come back, or not enough, or not in time. The trade routes did not reopen through the old channels, and the people who had said they were going for a year found that a year became 2, and then 5, and then their children had never lived in the stone enclosure and knew it only as a story, and the story changed, as stories do, and the enclosure waited. I have been talking for a long time, and we are far into the night now. I can feel the weight of it, the long hours, the many thousands of words that have travelled from here to wherever you are, and I want to give you, before I finally let you go, one more image to carry with you into sleep. Imagine the Great Enclosure on a clear night in the dry season. The moon is full, or nearly so, and the light it casts is strong enough to read by, or would be if you needed to read. The stone walls glow in the moonlight, pale grey, almost white, the shadows between the courses of stone sharp and regular. Nothing is moving. The bush around the enclosure is quiet, the particular quiet of a winter night when the insects are asleep and the birds have been still for hours. You can hear your own breathing if you pay attention. You can hear, if you are very still, the tiny sounds that make up what we call silence. A small animal moving in the grass 100 meters away, the almost inaudible settling of the stone as the temperature drops, the wind, if you can call it that, the merest movement of air across the plateau. The conical tower is in shadow, the moonlight falling on one side and leaving the other dark. It rises against the sky, which is full of stars, more stars than you have ever seen if you come from a city, an impossible number, a sky that feels three-dimensional rather than flat, the stars at different distances, creating a genuine sense of depth. You stand in the enclosure, and you feel, not quite for the first time, the thing I mentioned near the beginning of this night, the weight of time. The sense that you are standing inside something that time has passed through rather than around, that the stones remember what you cannot know, that the silence is full rather than empty. And then, from somewhere in the bush outside the walls, a nightjar begins to call. A churring, repetitive call that has no particular meaning in any human language, but is not quite without meaning either, because it is alive and it is here, and it is the sound of a creature going about its business in the dark, indifferent to the stones and the history and the mystery of where the people went, interested only in the insects that are beginning to wake as the night warms slightly toward morning. The call goes on for a minute or two, then it stops. The silence resumes. The stars continue their slow movement. The walls stand. You have been here long enough. It is time to go. If you are still awake, I'm a little surprised, and I respect it. You have stayed with one of history's quieter mysteries for a long time now, through the rising and the height and the gradual ending of a city that most of the world does not know existed. You have been in the company of people whose names are lost and whose stones are not. Let me close with this. The name Zimbabwe means, among other things, the houses of stone. The country of Zimbabwe, the modern nation, chose to name itself after these ruins as a statement of identity and inheritance. We are the people of the stone houses. Our civilization did not begin with colonialism. It did not begin with contact with Europe. It began here, on this plateau, with these walls, with these people who understood how to fit granite blocks together without mortar, and how to trade gold across an ocean they had never seen, and how to organize a city of 15,000 people in the highlands of southern Africa in the 13th century. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. That is the whole counter-narrative to a century of colonial distortion, contained in a name, pressed into the identity of a nation that carries the ruins in its flag and its currency and its sense of itself. Great Zimbabwe is not a lost civilization. It is a known civilization, incompletely known, with gaps that may never be filled. But the core of it is clear. The people were real. The city was real. The gold and the trade and the cattle and the walls and the ceremonies and the children making clay figures in the dust of the courtyard, all of it was real. They built something that outlasted them in the most literal sense. The walls are still standing, and on certain afternoons, when the light comes from the right angle and the shadows are long on the stone, you can feel, or something like feel, the presence of what was here. Not as ghost or as spirit, exactly, but as the residue of human effort and human care, pressed into granite, enduring beyond any reasonable expectation. That is what they left us, and that is enough to matter. Rest, now. You have been traveling. The walls are still standing. I said rest, and I meant it. But I am still here, and so are you. And there are things worth saying that I have not yet said. Let me tell you about the people who still live near the ruins. Not the ancient people, not the people of the medieval city, but the people of today, the families and communities whose land surrounds the UNESCO World Heritage Site, whose grandparents and great-grandparents grew up with the ruins as a feature of their everyday landscape. For these people, Great Zimbabwe is not primarily a historical mystery or a tourist attraction. It is a place with specific local significance, a place where certain kinds of events still happen, where certain obligations still apply, where the ancestors are understood to be present in a way that requires respectful behavior. Some communities in the area still perform ceremonies at or near the ruins, ceremonies that are understood to honor the ancestors whose remains are, in some spiritual sense, embedded in the place and the stones. This is not a romantic projection. It is the lived reality of people who have never left. While the colonial government, and later the post-colonial tourist industry, were turning Great Zimbabwe into a heritage site for international visitors, the people whose families had been living near the ruins for centuries were maintaining their own relationship with the place, a relationship that was older and in many ways, more complex than anything that could be captured in a guidebook. The relationship between local communities and heritage sites is always complicated, and Great Zimbabwe is no exception. The designation of the site as a national monument and later as a UNESCO World Heritage Site brought resources for preservation, but also restrictions on access and use. The people who had been treating the area as a living landscape, a place to graze cattle and collect firewood and conduct ceremonies, found themselves subject to rules made by distant authorities about what could and could not be done in and around the ruins. The cattle, whose grazing near the stone walls accelerated erosion, were excluded. Firewood collection was restricted. Some ceremonial activities were complicated by new boundaries and new regulations. These tensions between conservation and community use are not unique to Zimbabwe. They are found at heritage sites all over the world, and there is no easy resolution to them, because both sides of the tension are legitimate. The stones need protection from erosion and disturbance if they are to survive for future generations. The communities need access to the land and to the sacred sites that are part of their living spiritual practice. Navigating between these needs requires ongoing negotiation and genuine respect for both. What I want to say is simply this: the story of Great Zimbabwe did not end when the medieval city was abandoned. It continued in the form of the communities that lived near the ruins and incorporated them into their own history and identity. It continued in the form of the colonial distortions and the resistance to those distortions. It continues now in the ongoing work of archaeology and community relations and conservation, and the simple daily fact of people living near the ruins and going about their lives in proximity to something that happened a very long time ago and has not quite finished happening. Let me tell you about one specific person, a real person, who changed our understanding of Great Zimbabwe in a way that deserves to be better known than it is. Her name was Gertrude Catton Thompson, and I mentioned her earlier in the context of her 1,929 excavations. But I want to give her more credit than that brief mention suggested, because she was an extraordinary figure and her contribution deserves more than a footnote. Catton Thompson was born in London in 1888 into a comfortable family with the resources to support a woman's education at a time when women's education was not universally valued. She became interested in archaeology relatively late, studying under the great Egyptologist Flinders Petrie after the First World War, and developing her own distinctive approach to field archaeology that prioritized careful recording and systematic methodology over the spectacular find. When she was commissioned to investigate Great Zimbabwe in 1929, she was already an established archaeologist, known for her work in Egypt and the Fayum. She was not chosen because anyone expected her to make a dramatic discovery. She was chosen, partly, because her methodology was known to be rigorous and her conclusions were known to be careful. The British Association for the Advancement of Science, which commissioned the work, wanted conclusions that would be hard to challenge on methodological grounds. What Catton Thompson found when she excavated at Great Zimbabwe was exactly what the evidence demanded. A medieval African civilization built by the ancestors of the Shona people, with no significant connection to any outside ancient civilization. She found pottery sequences that matched African ceramic traditions. She found building techniques that were continuous with traditions used elsewhere in the region. She found no Phoenician artifacts, no Semitic inscriptions, no evidence of any ancient Mediterranean or Middle Eastern presence. Her conclusions were published in 1931 in a book called The Zimbabwe Culture, Ruins and Reactions, a title that acknowledged both the physical ruins and the political context of their interpretation. The book was methodologically impeccable. Her critics could not challenge the data. What they challenged, instead, was her interpretation, which they claimed was politically motivated by a desire to claim African achievement at the expense of truth. This accusation, leveled at someone whose entire career had been defined by rigorous empiricism, was ironic, given that her critics were the ones allowing politics to override evidence. But the irony was lost on those who wanted to believe what they wanted to believe. Catton Thompson continued to work in archaeology until well into the mid-20th century, but Great Zimbabwe remained perhaps her most significant contribution. She had, in a single rigorous field season, established the evidentiary basis for what we now know to be true about the ruins. Everything that came after her, all the subsequent work that refined and deepened our understanding, built on the foundation she laid. She died in 1985, at the age of 96. She had lived long enough to see Zimbabwe gain its independence, and to see the ruins reclaimed as the symbol of African civilization that her work had always shown them to be. I hope she found some satisfaction in that. The trade goods. I want to tell you more about the trade goods, because they are one of the most vivid pieces of evidence we have for the connections that made Great Zimbabwe possible, and I have not yet done them full justice. The Chinese porcelain fragments found at Great Zimbabwe are from a period roughly corresponding to the Song and Yuan dynasties, the 10th to 14th centuries. The Song dynasty was one of the most commercially sophisticated periods in Chinese history, a time when Chinese merchants and manufacturers were producing goods of extraordinary quality and exporting them across the known world. Chinese porcelain of the Song period reached every corner of the Indian Ocean world, from the ports of East Africa to the courts of Persia and Egypt, carried on Arab and Chinese trading vessels that ranged across the ocean with a regularity that modern people often find surprising. The specific types of porcelain found at Great Zimbabwe include celadon, a greenish glazed stoneware that was particularly prized across the Islamic world, and blue and white porcelain, which became fashionable slightly later. These pieces did not arrive at Great Zimbabwe intact and ready to use. They arrived as part of a trading stream that passed through multiple hands between the kilns of China and the stone enclosures of the plateau. A Chinese merchant ship carried the porcelain to a port in India or Ceylon. An Arab merchant there loaded it onto another vessel bound for the East African coast. It was offloaded at Kilwa or Sofala and traded to a Swahili merchant who traded it to an African trader heading inland, who carried it or had it carried through the river valleys to the plateau, where it was traded again, ultimately reaching the hands of someone at Great Zimbabwe with the status and wealth to receive it. Each step in this chain involved profit for the intermediary. The price of the porcelain at each transaction was higher than at the last. By the time a piece of Chinese celadon reached Great Zimbabwe, it had changed hands perhaps 6 or 8 times and travelled perhaps 6,000 kilometers. That it retained enough value to be worth trading after all that journey tells you something about how much gold could buy. The glass beads are perhaps even more striking, as evidence of long-distance connections. Beads of different compositions tell archaeologists where they were made, because the chemical composition of the glass reflects the materials available at the place of manufacture. Beads found at Great Zimbabwe include types made in India and types made in the Islamic world, specifically in Egypt and the Persian Gulf region. These tiny objects, some of them no bigger than a peppercorn, had crossed the Indian Ocean more than once before ending up in the soil of the Zimbabwe plateau, pressed into the earth by feet that had never left southern Africa. Beads were not merely decorative, though they were certainly valued as adornment. In many African contexts, specific types of beads carried specific status meanings. A woman wearing a particular type of bead from India was not just wearing jewelry, she was wearing a visible marker of her access to exotic goods, her position in the social hierarchy, her connection to the networks that brought such things from so far away. The bead was a portable, wearable declaration of status. This is why the distribution of imported beads across the site is so informative. The most exotic and rare bead types cluster in the elite enclosures. The more common types spread further out. The distribution reflects the social hierarchy as precisely as if someone had drawn a map of it. I want to tell you something about the acoustics of the Great Enclosure, because it is something I have not seen discussed much, and it seems worth noting. The Great Enclosure is not just a visual experience, it is also an acoustic one. The stone walls that rise nearly 11 meters around the interior create an enclosed space with specific sound properties, a space in which the human voice carries in particular ways, in which certain frequencies resonate while others are absorbed. In a pre-electric world, before amplification and recorded sound, the acoustic properties of a ceremonial space were not incidental to its design. The builders of great ceremonial spaces across the world, from the temples of Egypt to the churches of medieval Europe to the ball courts of Mesoamerica, We're often attentive to sound, in ways that are not immediately obvious when we look at the physical remains. A space that makes a speaker's voice carry further, or that creates particular resonances at certain frequencies, is a space that is more effective for ceremony and ritual and public address than a space with different acoustic properties. We cannot know with certainty whether the builders of the Great Enclosure were conscious of its acoustic properties or deliberately designed for them. The construction happened over generations, and there is no surviving document that describes the intentions of the builders. But it is worth noting that the shape and scale of the enclosure would have created specific sound effects that a community, using the space for ceremony, would have experienced repeatedly over generations. When a ceremony was held in the Great Enclosure, when voices rose in prayer or song or the formal address of the king to his assembled subjects, the stone walls would have given those voices a particular quality, a fullness and a resonance that open-air address does not have. The experience of being inside the walls would have been different from the experience of being outside them in ways that went beyond the visual. The sound of the space would have been part of what the space meant, part of what made it different from the ordinary world. This is speculation, admittedly, but it is informed speculation, and it points towards something important about how these ruins should be understood. They were not just buildings in the modern sense, not just functional enclosures for living and working. They were designed and redesigned and extended over generations to create a particular kind of experience. The beauty of the outer wall's regular courses and decorative patterns, visible to anyone approaching the enclosure, was intentional. The height of the walls, making the interior impossible to see from outside, was intentional. The narrow passage between the inner and outer walls, forcing anyone entering to slow down and move single file and experience the enclosure gradually, was intentional. The people who built Great Zimbabwe were architects, in the fullest sense of the word. They were shaping space to create specific effects, to communicate specific things about power and authority and sacred significance. The fact that we cannot decode all the specific messages they intended does not mean those messages were not there. It means we have lost the key. There is a question that I have been circling around for this entire night, and I want to address it directly now as we approach something like the end. The question is, why does this matter? It matters for many reasons, but let me give you the one that feels most important to me. The story of Great Zimbabwe is, among other things, a story about what happens when people in power need the past to say something it does not say. The colonial government of Rhodesia needed the ruins of Great Zimbabwe to have been built by non-Africans, and so they promoted that theory and suppressed the evidence against it. And the result was decades of distorted scholarship and destroyed evidence and confused popular understanding. This was not an unusual situation in the history of the uses of the past. Throughout human history, powerful interests have sought to control the narrative about where we came from, because the story of the past is also, inevitably, a story about who deserves to be where they are in the present. When Gertrude Caton Thompson and her successors established the African origin of Great Zimbabwe on solid evidentiary grounds, they were not just making an academic contribution, they were resisting a political attempt to distort history in the service of injustice. And when Zimbabwe claimed the ruins as its own symbol, naming the country after them and putting the Zimbabwe bird on the flag, that was a continuation of the same resistance, an assertion that history belongs to the people who made it, not to those who conquered their descendants. This has implications beyond African history, beyond Zimbabwe, beyond the specific question of who built the stone walls on the plateau. It is a general principle. The past belongs to everyone, and when someone tries to claim it exclusively for their own purposes, the appropriate response is the kind of patient, rigorous, evidence-based inquiry that Caton Thompson exemplified. Not louder claims, not competing ideologies, just careful attention to what the evidence actually says. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe say, clearly and specifically, and without ambiguity, people lived here. They built this. They were extraordinary. They are the ancestors of people alive today. Honor them. That is the message in the stone. It was there before Karl Mauck arrived, and before Cecil Rhodes claimed the territory, and before the colonial government promoted its false theories. And before Caton Thompson cleared the debris and the misidentifications away, it was always there, in the stone, waiting for someone willing to read it honestly. Now, truly, it is time. The night has been long, the story has been long, and you are somewhere on the spectrum between nearly asleep and deeply asleep, and wherever you are on that spectrum is the right place to be. I want to leave you with the sounds of the plateau as I imagine them on a still, clear night in the 14th century, when the city was alive and the fires were burning and the stars were the same stars that burn tonight above wherever you are sleeping. The low sound of cattle, the quiet breathing of sleeping animals, the occasional soft movement of a herd finding a more comfortable position in the dark, the distant sound of a drum from somewhere in the city, a ceremony still going on in one of the enclosures in the valley below, the rhythm steady and low and continuous, the sound of a woman singing, not loudly, a kind of under-the-breath singing, the singing of someone doing night work who fills the darkness with sound to push back the quiet, the creak of a door or a gate moving in a slight wind, the crying of a child, brief and then comforted, and then silence again, and above it all, the stars. And the stone walls, warm from the day's sun, beginning slowly to release their heat into the night air, and the conical tower, standing as it always stands, in the particular silence of things that endure. The plateau breathes, the city sleeps, you sleep, and somewhere in the morning that is coming, without hurry, across the flat-topped hills and the thorn trees and the red earth roads, the light is already beginning to gather itself, though you cannot see it yet. The birds know. They are stirring in the trees around the walls, waking to a day that will be just like the other days, just like all the days this place has held. Sleep well. The houses of stone are standing, and the people who built them, though their names are lost, are not entirely gone. There is one more thread I want to pull before I finally let the night close. I have talked about gold and cattle and walls and trade. I have talked about kings and ancestors and rain ceremonies. I have talked about colonial distortions and archaeological discoveries and the persistence of oral tradition. But I have not yet talked about beauty, and I think beauty deserves a place in this story. The people of Great Zimbabwe made beautiful things. This is not a secondary fact about them, not a footnote. It is one of the most important facts about any civilization. What they made, and whether they made it well, and whether the making of it mattered to them beyond its practical function. The outer wall of the Great Enclosure is beautiful. I have said this before, but I want to say it again with more precision. The beauty is not accidental. The decorative chevron pattern near the top of the wall, the herringbone design visible in several sections, required additional skill and planning beyond what was needed to simply stack stones. Someone decided that the wall should not just be functional, but should also be a thing of visual interest, a thing that rewarded close looking. That decision was an aesthetic one, a decision that beauty mattered. The soapstone birds are beautiful. They are also mysterious and ceremonially significant, and those qualities are not separate from their beauty. They were made to be looked at, held in the mind, returned to. Their strange hybrid quality, the human bird face, the stylized feathers, the particular angle at which the head is held, all of it is deliberate and considered and skilled. The person or persons who carved them were artists, and the word is not too strong. The pottery is beautiful. Not all of it. Much ancient pottery is purely functional, and the utilitarian pots of Great Zimbabwe were not primarily made for beauty. But some of the decorated pottery found at the site shows genuine aesthetic sophistication, the patterns pressed into the clay before firing arranged with a sense of rhythm and proportion that goes beyond the merely adequate. Someone thought about how the pattern would look when the pot was finished. Someone cared. And the carved soapstone bowls found at the site, some of them decorated with geometric patterns and with animal figures including cattle and baboons and hunting scenes, are remarkable objects. They are small, fitting comfortably in two hands, made of a stone that is soft enough to carve with iron tools, but hard enough to take a smooth polish. The carving is precise and patient, and shows a familiarity with the material, an understanding of how the stone responds to the tool that comes only from practice and tradition. These objects were not made for export. They are not found in the trading ports of the coast or in the collections of distant civilizations. They were made for use within the community that produced them, for the ceremonies and daily life of the plateau civilization. They were made because beauty mattered to the people of Great Zimbabwe, not as a luxury or an external imposition, but as something intrinsic to the life they were living. This, too, is part of what was lost when the city declined. The specific tradition of soapstone carving associated with Great Zimbabwe essentially ended with the city's abandonment. Later stone-building cultures in the region had their own aesthetic traditions, but the specific forms of the Great Zimbabwe soapstone objects, the birds, the bowls, the decorative patterns, did not survive in recognizable form. They are, in the most precise sense, unique to their time and place. I want to tell you about water. Water is the limiting resource of life on the plateau, more fundamental even than gold, more fundamental even than cattle. Because without water, the cattle die and the gold means nothing. The Zimbabwe plateau is not a desert. It receives adequate rainfall in most years, but the distribution of that rainfall is uneven, and the interval between rainy seasons, the long dry months from May to October, requires careful management of water resources if you are going to maintain a large population in one place. Great Zimbabwe sits near enough to the Mutirikwe River to have had access to water in the valley below, but the river is seasonal, its flow diminishing dramatically in the dry season. The spring sources closer to the hill complex would have been more reliable, but not unlimited. Maintaining a population of 15,000 people through a 7-month dry season requires either very efficient water management or access to water sources from a wide area. We know almost nothing about how Great Zimbabwe managed its water supply in the medieval period. The surface evidence is limited, and the underground infrastructure, if there was any, has not been found or has not survived. But it is inconceivable that a city of this size, in this climate, did not have some organized system for water collection, storage, and distribution. The alternative, that 15,000 people simply managed on whatever water was available from nearby sources without any communal management, does not hold up when you think about the logistics. The question of water management at Great Zimbabwe is one of the open questions that more detailed archaeological investigation might eventually illuminate. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey methods, which were not available to the early investigators, might reveal subsurface features that could tell us about drainage channels, cisterns, or other water infrastructure. This kind of investigation has not yet been done systematically at the site, in part because so much of the archaeological effort over the past several decades has been focused on preservation rather than exploration. What we can say is that the management of water resources was one of the practical challenges that any political authority at Great Zimbabwe would have had to address, and that the ability to guarantee reliable water supply to the population was probably part of what it meant to exercise authority there. Control of water, like control of gold and control of cattle, was a form of power. When the rains failed, the water sources diminished. The shallow springs near the hill complex would have been the first to dry. The river in the valley would have shrunk to a trickle. In a year of genuinely poor rainfall, water stress would have been a real and serious problem. In a sequence of bad years, it could have been catastrophic. There is a certain grim elegance to the way that the same climate that had made the plateau attractive in the first place could, in its variability, make it uninhabitable. The volcanic soils that made agriculture productive were dependent on the rains. The rivers that made settlement possible in the dry season could dry up in a drought year. The landscape that had seemed so generous could, when the rains failed, become something much less welcoming. This was not unique to Great Zimbabwe. Every agricultural civilization in the pre-modern world lived with this vulnerability. The great river civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia managed it through irrigation and the organized control of river flow. The civilizations of the American Southwest managed it through careful dry-land farming techniques and elaborate water collection systems. The people of the Zimbabwe Plateau managed it through cattle, whose mobility allowed them to follow the rains, and through the social mechanisms that distributed resources across a wide area. But city life concentrates people. and concentrated people are less able to simply follow the rains. When the rains fail in a city, you cannot move the city. You can only move the people. And moving 15,000 people is not a simple thing. Let me now tell you about two objects that I have not yet mentioned. Objects that represent, in their very different ways, the two faces of Great Zimbabwe's civilization. The first is a large bronze gong, found during excavations in the valley enclosures. Gongs of this type were used across parts of sub-Saharan Africa as instruments of communication and ceremony, their deep, resonant sound carrying across long distances in the open air. The specific type found at Great Zimbabwe is of a kind that has parallels elsewhere in the region, suggesting it was part of a shared musical and ceremonial tradition. It would have been struck with a wooden mallet, and the sound it produced would have been a sound the city knew, a sound associated with ceremony and authority, and the particular resonance that important sounds accumulate in a community over time. Imagine that sound in the Great Enclosure, the deep boom of the gong reverberating off the stone walls, filling the enclosed space with a sound that was both deeply physical and somehow beyond the physical, a sound that vibrated in the chest and the ears, and maybe somewhere else, somewhere harder to name. The second object is a miniature stone pestle, barely larger than a thumb, found in a midden near one of the valley enclosures. It is not decorated. It is not made from a special stone. It shows signs of use, the working end smoothed by contact with whatever was ground against it. It is, in all likelihood, a child's toy, a small-scale imitation of the grinding stones that were the most common and most essential tools of the household. A child who played with this pestle was playing at adult work, practicing the motions of the grinding that she would spend much of her adult life doing. She was learning, through play, what it meant to be part of the community she had been born into. She was taking her place, in the smallest possible way, in the long chain of women who had knelt over the grinding stones every morning, from the foundation of the city to the day it was abandoned. The gong and the pestle, the ceremonial and the quotidian, the resonant public sound and the quiet private gesture of a child at play. Both are part of what Great Zimbabwe was. Neither is more real than the other. Neither is more important, in the end, than the other. The sound of the gong has been silent for 600 years. The pestle is in a museum storage drawer somewhere, labelled and catalogued, waiting for someone to study it and write about it, or perhaps just waiting. Both of them were real. Both of them mattered to someone. Both of them ended up in the soil of a city that became empty, and both of them waited in that soil until someone came along and found them, and now you know about them. That is what archaeology does, at its best. It goes into the ground and finds what was left there and brings it back into the light and says, "This was here. These people were here. They lived and worked and played and prayed and eventually left, and this is what they left behind." It is not enough. It is never enough. But it is something. The last light of the fire. Every fire that was ever lit inside the Great Enclosure has been out for 600 years. The last fire, the one that burned on the last night that someone slept inside those walls, went cold at some point in the mid-15th century and has not been relit since. The charcoal from that fire is in the soil. Archaeological tools could find it, carbon date it, tell us approximately when it burned, but the specific people who gathered around it, the specific words they said or songs they sang or silences they shared, are gone as completely as anything can be gone. This is the hardest part of the mystery of Great Zimbabwe. Not the question of who built it, which we can answer with confidence. Not the question of what the carved birds meant, which we can approximate. Not even the question of where the people went, which we can partially reconstruct. The hardest part is the interior life, the experience of being there, the texture of a single day in the city at its height, with all its specific sensations and meanings and relationships. The day as it felt to live it, from the inside, that is gone. That is the thing we cannot recover, no matter how careful and rigorous our archaeology is, no matter how many ground-penetrating radar surveys we conduct, or how many pollen cores we analyze, or how many trade goods we trace back to their origins. The experience of living in Great Zimbabwe is irretrievably lost, as the experience of living in any pre-literate civilization is irretrievably lost. which is most of the civilizations that have ever existed. And this is perhaps the most important thing to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. The awareness that most of human experience is like this. Most of what has ever been thought and felt and lived by human beings is not recorded anywhere. It was thought and felt and lived, and then it was over. And the people who did it became other people, and the other people became us. And we carry almost none of the specific content of that experience in any conscious form. What we carry is something more fundamental than content. We carry the capacity for it, the ability to feel the full range of human experience, from the most exalted to the most mundane, from the sound of a gong in a stone enclosure to the motion of a child's hand pressing a toy pestle into an imaginary grinding stone. That capacity we share with the people of Great Zimbabwe, across 6 centuries and 2 continents, and every difference of language and belief and custom and history, we share the basic structure of human experience. That is why their story is also our story. Not because we are descended from them, though some of us may be in ways we cannot trace, but because we are the same kind of creature they were, with the same fears and the same longings and the same tendency to build things that outlast us and leave marks in stone that we did not intend as monuments, but that become monuments anyway. We are all leaving marks in the things we build and the things we say and the relationships we maintain and the children we raise who will become people we cannot fully imagine. We are all, in some small way, building something that might outlast us in stone, or might outlast us only in the memory of a few people who loved us. But something. The people of Great Zimbabwe built walls that are still standing after 600 years of abandonment. Most of what we build will not last that long, but the impulse to build it, the impulse to make something that matters and that lasts, that is the same impulse. That has not changed. Close your eyes, now, if they are not already closed. Let the story settle into you the way rain settles into dry earth, slow and deep and without drama. The plateau is quiet. The walls are standing. The stars are moving in their ancient circuits above the hill where the king's enclosure once held the carved birds that now live in museums. The grass is growing where the daga houses used to be. The river in the valley below runs lower than it once did, and the farmers who live near it now are dealing with their own questions about rainfall and soil and the future. The mystery remains. It will probably always remain, at least in part. We will learn more as archaeology continues, and as the oral traditions are more carefully recorded, and as new analytical techniques allow us to ask new questions of the evidence. But we will never know everything. There is no version of this story that ends with complete knowledge, with all the gaps filled and all the questions answered. That is all right. The mystery is not a failure. It is a sign that something real was here, something complicated and human and resistant to simple summary. Simple things do not generate complex mysteries. Great Zimbabwe is a complex mystery because it was a complex place, full of real people doing real things for real reasons, in a world that mattered to them in ways we can only partially reconstruct. The mystery is the shape of what we have lost. Honor the mystery, and you honor what it stands in for. Sleep well. The houses of stone are still standing, in the dark, in the quiet, in the breathing African night, waiting for the morning the way they have waited for every morning for 600 years. And the people who built them, though we cannot name them and cannot fully know them, are part of the long chain of human beings who shaped this world and handed it on, imperfect and beautiful and full of mystery, to the people who came after, to us. Sleep. One last thing. Just one more, and then I am done. There is a practice among certain communities in Zimbabwe and in other parts of southern Africa called kuombera, or something like it. The practice of pouring out a small amount of drink before you drink, onto the ground, as an offering to the ancestors. It is a gesture of acknowledgement, a way of saying, I remember you are here. I remember you were here before me. I share this with you. It is a small gesture. It costs almost nothing, and it contains, in its small way, the whole of what the relationship between the living and the dead can be. Not the elaborate ceremony of a great city, not the sacrifice of a prime ox, not the prayers of priests in a carved stone enclosure, just a small outpouring, a recognition a refusal to pretend that the past is not part of the present. When I think about Great Zimbabwe, I think about that gesture, about what it would mean to pour something out for the people who built those walls, to acknowledge them not as a historical curiosity, but as people who were here, who did something remarkable, who are part of the long human story that brought us to wherever we are sitting or lying tonight. They do not need the acknowledgement, strictly speaking. They are not waiting for it. The dead have moved on from whatever wanting or needing means, or so most traditions suggest. But we need to make the gesture. We need to make it for ourselves, to keep ourselves honest about what we owe to the past, to resist the temptation to think of history as a story that began when we arrived and will end when we leave. The history of this place, of this plateau, of these walls, goes back 800 years before any European eye saw them, and it was rich and complex and fully human for every one of those 800 years. The mystery of where the people went is a mystery in our understanding of them, not in their own experience. They knew where they were going, they chose it, they lived their lives. We are the ones who lost them, and we are the ones who are still, slowly, finding them again. Sleep, now. The finding continues tomorrow, and the night is long and the walls are standing, and somewhere over the plateau, the first birds are beginning to think about singing. Rest well. There is a quality of patience embedded in stone that I find myself thinking about often when I think about Great Zimbabwe. Stone does not hurry. Stone does not need to. It has already arrived at its destination, which is simply to be what it is, in the place where it is. For as long as the forces of erosion and seismic movement have not yet moved it somewhere else. The granite of the Zimbabwe plateau has been there in some form for hundreds of millions of years, long before any human hand touched it, long before any human eye recognized its qualities as a building material. When the builders of Great Zimbabwe chose this stone and shaped it and placed it, they were borrowing something from an almost incomprehensible depth of time. They were taking material that had been forming since before there were human beings and using it to make something human, something that bore the marks of intention and care and the particular human desire to build something that will last. And it has lasted. Not because they built it with some special technique that ordinary human effort could not have achieved, but because granite is hard and dry, stone construction is surprisingly stable, and the plateau climate, while variable, does not include the freeze-thaw cycles that destroy masonry in colder climates. The walls have lasted because the conditions were favorable, and because the stone was well chosen, and because the builders were skilled. None of these things are miraculous. All of them are real. The most recent archaeological surveys of the site have used drone photography and photogrammetric mapping to create detailed three-dimensional models of the standing structures. These models can be used to track changes in the walls over time, identifying sections that are leaning or crumbling, allowing conservation teams to prioritize interventions before collapse occurs. This combination of ancient stone and contemporary technology is, in its way, a continuation of the story. Human beings paying attention to these walls. Human beings caring whether they stand or fall. The Great Zimbabwe Monument is managed by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe. It receives a steady stream of international tourists and a much larger stream of Zimbabwean visitors, many of them school groups. Children bust in from around the country to stand in front of the walls and be told, "This is ours, this is where we came from, this is what our ancestors built." The school children do what school children do everywhere. They fidget, they talk to each other, they look at their phones, if they have them. They pay partial attention to the guide and fuller attention to whatever is happening among their friends. And then, sometimes, something catches one of them. The size of the wall, the conical tower, the narrow passage between the inner and outer walls, the view from the hill complex. Something catches them and they stop for a moment, in the way that all of us stop when we encounter something that exceeds our expectations. That moment of stopping, that involuntary pause, that is the ruins doing what ruins do best, which is to give the present moment its context, to make the person standing in it aware that the world is older and stranger and more layered than daily life usually suggests. The child who stops in front of those walls is receiving something from the people who built them across 6 centuries of silence, a transmission without words, a statement made in stone and still legible, still arriving, still doing its work. That transmission is real. It is one of the realest things I know of, and it is still happening tonight, as the walls stand in the dark and the stars move above them, and you drift slowly towards sleep, carrying with you, in whatever form it has taken, a little of what this story holds. The houses of stone endure. The people who built them are not entirely gone, and the night, at last, is quiet. Rest in the knowing. The walls are not waiting for you to understand them. They are simply standing. That is enough. That has always been enough. The mystery of Great Zimbabwe is a mystery that rewards patient attention, not resolution. Sit with what you know, and let what you do not know remain in its proper place, which is the comfortable dark at the edge of the knowable. The builders would not have expected you to understand everything. They did not understand everything themselves. They built what they could build, traded what they could trade, and loved, in their own way, the place that held them. And then they left. And the place held the memory of them in the only way a place can, which is by remaining, by standing in the particular light of the plateau mornings, by continuing to be the place they made it, long after they were gone. That is the story. That is all of it that can be told. The rest is in the stone. The plateau holds its silence the way it has always held silence, between the rains and after the rains, and in the long golden dry season, when the grass goes still and the air is clear and the stars at night are everything. The stone enclosures hold their silence inside their walls. The courtyard of the Great Enclosure open to the sky, the passage between the inner and outer walls, holding the particular cool of deep shade, even in the midday heat. The hill complex holds its silence above the valley, the view from the top unchanged in its essential character since the last person looked out from it 6 centuries ago. The plateau rolling away to every horizon, the kopjes rising from the grass in their rounded ancient forms, the rivers, visible in the dry season, only as lines of greener trees, tracing their courses through the grass. All of this is still here. All of this is waiting. Not for explanation, not for resolution, simply waiting in the way that real things wait, which is by continuing to be what they are, patient and specific, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone is watching. The walls stand whether or not you are there to see them. The mystery persists whether or not anyone is asking the question. And the night over the plateau is full of stars, whether or not anyone is lying awake under it, looking up. You, perhaps, are no longer looking up. Perhaps your eyes are closed. Perhaps the story has done what it came to do, which is to carry you a little way out of your own present and into a larger world. A world old enough to make the present feel less urgent and more interesting. A world where the big questions are genuinely open and the evidence is incomplete and the people who built things are gone, but the things themselves remain. That is where we live, all of us, whether we know it or not. In the long shadow of what came before, in the specific and unrepeatable present, on our way to becoming the past that someone else will find someday and wonder about. Sleep now. The rest can wait.